Chapter 126, Bullying Drake. Just when Tatsuya started to unconsciously release his energy, a lot of distortion started to take place in the nearby areas. Suddenly, the barrier surrounding them broke and a person clad in white draconic armor with giant blue wings appeared. But none of them cared about the person, as all of them, including the person himself, were focused on Tatsuya. The person then landed beside Tatsuya's team and was then noticed by the others. The people who didn't know him got shocked and immediately went to their battle stance, but the person didn't even look at them and asked Tatsuya's team, what happened here to make him go this serious? The girls in Tatsuya's team looked at the person in the armor and said, Valikuin, nothing special, he just got on his bad side after hurting one of us. Valley then looked at Tatsuya and Kokobile for a while and said, he is a goner. Tatsuya's team nodded their heads and looked back at him and saw Kokobile screaming while his body was covered in black flames. His team had a sweat drop and said, from the looks of it, he is determined to torture him instead of killing him. Hearing them, the others had a sweat drop as well. Suddenly, Isami's gauntlet materialized and said, are you forgetting about me, White One? Making Isami surprised. The wings on Vala's back suddenly glowed and a voice was heard which said, oh, so you have been awakened, Drake. It has been a long time. The gem on Isami's gauntlet glowed as well and the voice said, yes, it has been a long time. So are you here to fight? Hearing his question, all of them looked at Valley as it was getting a bit nastier to look at Tatsuya's battle as it had turned into a bit gruesome. Vala, who was still covered in the armor, shook his head and said, no, I came here to neutralize Kokobile, but I don't think that will be needed anymore. All of them nodded and then suddenly a magic circle appeared near them and Tiamat came out of it. She had a serious expression on her face, but once she saw that the others were all right, she sighed and became normal. She then looked towards Tatsuya's direction and saw him beating Kokobile ruthlessly and then healing him to beat him again, and while doing that he had an amused smile on his face. She then turned towards the others and pointed at Tatsuya and said, what happened? The others then told her what happened and she looked back at Tatsuya for a while and said, he is a goner. All of them again nodded their heads and then Tiamat looked at Valley and said, oh, the white jerk is here. The wings on the back of Valley again glowed and Albion said, and I see that the brood hag is here as well. So how old are you, no dash? Before he was able to continue, Albion felt a sudden killing intent which was coming from Tiamat. Tiamat still had a smile on her face, looked at the wings and said, what happened, go on, and raised her hand before turning it into a claw. Albion immediately got silent and said, I was saying that you were looking young as ever. Tiamat continued to smile and turned her hand back to normal and kept it down and said, oh, thanks for the compliment. All the others sweat drop at that and Drake muttered, aggressive hag, but immediately regretted that when he felt some killing intent aimed at him. Soon Tiamat calmed down and a smile came on her face. She looked at Albion and said, you know Albion, recently Drake is having dreams about dominating Dash, and paused for a bit. Hearing that some of them who were there understood what Tiamat was going to talk about and Drake felt that G started sweating. The gem on the gauntlet immediately glowed and said, HAG, stay silent I beg you. Tiamat looked at Drake with an amused smile on her face and said, Drake-kun, why don't you calm down for a bit? Don't you see that I am talking to Albion? Vala's wings then began to glow and Albion then said, what is wrong with that? Since he represents dominance, it is right for him to dash. Before he was able to finish, Tiamat interrupted him and said, let me finesse first. What I am saying is that Drake is having dreams about Dash. Drake again interrupted her and said, I beg you don't say that, Dash, but Tiamat ignored him and said, dominating you. Albion was again about to say that it was no problem as both of them were rivals and have been fighting for years, but Tiamat didn't allow him to say anything and said, in bed that is. The surroundings turned completely silent and everyone who didn't knew about it before looked at the gauntlet with a weird expression, except for Rias and Irina, who were still unconscious and sent back along with Tsubaki respectively. Drake, who felt the gazes aimed at him, started to feel a bit awkward and said, Albion, who came out of shock after hearing the voice, remained silent for a while and said, sorry Drake, but I don't swing that way. Drake, who heard that, felt got a bit pissed and was about to say something, but Isami interrupted him and said, don't worry Drake, this might be the first time that you have been rejected, it must have hurt a lot. Don't worry, we will find a new man. Male dragon for you, and started caressing her gauntlet. Drake, who now had enough of all that, got agitated and the gem on the gauntlet started to glow and the voice shouted, I told you that I am not interested in males. The only wish I have is to fight with Albion. So don't misunderstand and get in between us. Hearing that, Tiamat came forward and said, what he means to say is that he is not interested in other males and only wants to fight Albion, in bed that is. And he is a Yandere, so if you come between his love he will tear you apart. Hearing that, all of them sweat dropped and looked at her with a weird expression. But Isami nodded her head and said, Jis feelings were so deep, somehow I feel a bit sorry for him. Drake was about to refute but suddenly felt another hand on the gauntlet and stopped. He then looked at the person who touched the gauntlet and found it to be Miyuki, who was looking at the gauntlet with a helpless smile and said, I know how you feel Drake. The feeling of wanting to destroy anything and killing anyone who gets close to the person you love, I really understand you. Don't listen to them. Kill all of them who come in between you and your beloved person. Now all of them, including Tiamat, were looking at the two girls with a dumbfounded expression and Tiamat said, they actually bought that nonsense. All, except Isami and Miyuki, looked at her and thought, so, you knew what you were saying was nonsense. Suddenly another magic circle appears near them and a twin-tailed magical girl came out with a cheerful expression on her face and asked, hey everyone, what is happening here? All of them looked at her, and before they could say something the gem on the gauntlet glowed and all of them heard, UWAAA. They all are bullying me. You all are big meanies. At this all of them sweat dropped, and the only thought that they had was, why the hell are you talking like Seraphal? Chapter 127, The Three-Way War. While everyone was bullying the magical girl, dragon of domination Tatsuya was fighting the mega-evolved fallen angel. Kokobile, whose neck was snapped by Tatsuya, suddenly got covered in flames and his neck was regenerated. A wide grin appeared on his face and he said, "Ha ha ha, not even such lethal attacks can affect me now. I am starting to like this power." He then glared at Tatsuya and said, "Now let's see how long will you survive." Tatsuya, who was looking at him coldly, then said, "Do you seriously think that I can't kill you because you have some chicken's power?" Kokobile smirked, "Of course you can't, because unlike those disgusting devils I am not weak against holy element. And it is not like I have a mindset to get overwhelmed by this kind of situation. I survived the Great War. Do you really have any chance of beating me?" Tatsuya looked at him coldly for a while and then an evil grin appeared on his face and he said, "Then it only means that I have to test till what extent your mind can bear," and immediately activated his Sharingan and said, "Amaterasu." And immediately Kokobile's body was covered in black flames which started burning his body. Kokobile, who saw the flames first, snorted, thinking that the flames will not affect him because he had the Phoenix bloodline in him, but soon he noticed that his regeneration was not able to keep up with him, and he started panicking. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, "You, what have you done?" Tatsuya, who saw the look on his face, only smiled and said, "Don't worry, it is just the beginning," and then formed a lot of lightning spears around him and covered them with the Amaterasu and fired them at Kokobile. Kokobile, who saw the spears flying towards him, got panicked and immediately formed a sort of portal in front of him, and the spears entered the portal without harming him. Tatsuya, who saw the spears getting sucked in the portal, looked at him and said, "Abden's power of the whole." Suddenly an idea came to his mind and a bright smile appeared on his face and he asked, "Hey, do you like to do it from the back?" Kokobile, who was still being burned by the flames, looked at Tatsuya with a weird expression on his face and said, "What does it have to do with this situation?" Tatsuya continued to smile and said, "Nothing. I am now also going to use the power of the whole," and casted a genjutsu on the fallen angel. Suddenly as something penetrated Kokobile from the behind. Kokobile turned around to see who was the one to do that to him and saw a very huge man wearing magical girl costume behind him. The man gave him a wink and said, "How's my magical stick?" Kokobile, who saw the strange creature behind, got shocked and said, "Who are you, and how dare you put that thing inside?" The man who the question said, "I am the magical girl Miltan," and did a pose. Kokobile, who still had the magic stick, got shivers all over his body and shouted, "H, don't move." Suddenly he was embraced by someone from the front and looked up to see another one of the creature who was behind him and said, "Now who the hell are you?" The man gave a wink to Kokobile and said, "I am the magical girl Miltan too," and do the pose. The man then looked at Kokobile and then at the person behind him and asked, "So shall we begin?" The man behind Kokobile nodded his head and said, "Yes, let's start." Kokobile then looked at the two men back and forth and asked, "Begin what?" Both the men then smiled and said, "The three-way war," and then both of them starts moving closer to the fallen angel. Kokobile, who saw them coming towards him, wanted to run away, but for some reason his body was not moving. He looked at the two creatures with evident fear in his eyes and said, No, stay away from me. No, stay away from me. Stay away from me." But the men did not stop and kept on getting closer to Kokobile, and once their bodies were touching, both the men came closer to his ears and said, "SHHHH. Let's start the war, and who knows, we can do the four-way war after this." Kokobile, who heard them, got scared and shouted, Oh. Tatsuya, who was watching his body burning with the black flames, kept on healing him when he was at the point of near death to let him fight the war for a long time, and while he was doing that, he also kept on piercing his body with a lot of spears covered in magic which corrupted his body from the inside. Soon he noticed a lot of people looking at him, and he turned around and saw the others looking at him and asked, "What?" Serafal came near him and then pointed at Kokobile and asked, "What happened to him?" Tatsuya looked at her for a while and turned towards Kokobile and said, "He is fighting the three-way war." Hearing that, all of them got confused and looked at Tatsuya for answers. Tatsuya looked at them for a while and then said, "Do you really want to know? I am warning beforehand, the answer may make you unable to sleep for nights and even make you puke. So do it at your own risk." Hearing that, all of their thoughts wavered, but still two brave dragons, Tiamat and Valley, along with the magical girl Serafal, nodded their heads and came forward. Tatsuya looked at them for a while and then said, "Down, don't blame me later," and then sent the image of what was happening to Kokobile inside the illusion to their brain. Just within a few seconds, all three of them fainted with some foam coming out of their mouths. Tatsuya caught Serafal and Tiamat while Vala crashed on the ground with his armor getting deactivated. Tatsuya then looked at Vala and said, "Even a heavenly dragon was defeated by the side of the three-way war." He then landed and came near the girls and made both Tiamat and Serafal lie on the ground. All of them were about to ask some questions from him, but before they were able to, Tatsuya said, "Want to see what they saw?" At this, all of them became silent and didn't say anything, but yet again a brave dragon came forward and the gauntlet on Isami's hand spoke. "I want to know. I want to see what sight can make even Albion unconscious." Tatsuya nodded and then sent the image to Drake's mind while making sure that Isami did not see anything. Soon some sparks came out of the gauntlet and the dragon inside the gauntlet stopped speaking. Tatsuya looked at the gauntlet and said, "Yet again another heavenly dragon lost." Chapter 128. After the war. After everyone was once again conscious, they all sighed, thinking that what they all saw was just a dream, but once they noticed Kokobile, whose body was devoid of any movement in the sky with black flames all around him, all of them became stiff. Serafal then looked around and then immediately lashed onto Sona and started sniffing and touching her all over. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "There is no way a magical girl can be like that." Tatsuya, who currently being hugged by Tiamat and was patting her head, said, "Oh, you have yet to see a whole lot in the world, Sarah. That person is one of the regulars in my restaurant. Valley, who was looking at the motionless body of the fallen angel, thought, how can someone be so cruel? Albion, how long was I passed out for? The heavenly dragon sighed and said, I was unconscious as well, partner. The scene shocked me as well, and since I heard Drake dreaming doing those things with me, the effect was much more worse. Both of them kept looking at the dragon for a while and then thought at the same time, let's look at some buts once we go back home. He will be looking at some buts once he goes back. Tatsuya then looked at Valley and asked, so what are the orders? Kill him or take him back alive? Valley came out of his thoughts and looked at Tatsuya while thinking, how can he talk normally after making someone suffer like that? He then sighed and said, Azazel told me to take him back alive for interrogation. He then looked back at the fallen angel and said, but I don't think that he will be able to answer anything after that. All of them looked at Tatsuya, who averted his gaze and said, well, let's bring him back to his senses. He then went towards Kokobile and make him snap out of the genjutsu and made his body back to normal as it was before he mega-evolved. The magic he used to corrupt his body destroyed the contents of the vial, making him turn back to normal. Once Kokobile came back to reality, he didn't move a muscle for complete 10 minutes. Seeing that he has no intentions of moving, Tatsuya used some lightning and electrocuted his body. When the electricity passed through his body, his eyes widened and he said, oh, www. That hurts. Who the hell did that? Tatsuya looked at H with a smile and then said, so how was the three-way war? When Tatsuya mentioned the war, Kokobile grabbed his butt and then hugged Jis' own body and started shivering and said, don't talk about that. There is no way that a war can be that brutal. Even the old war was much better than that. Tatsuya then looked at Valley and said, here is your lil old Kokoballs. Make sure to lock him up real tight. Valley then sighed and made a transport circle and was about to teleport Kokobile away, but before he was able to, Tatsuya immediately cut all of his wings, making blood splutter out of his back. But Kokobile, who was now completely used to the pain, didn't felt anything and kept on shivering while hugging himself. Tatsuya, who saw that, clicked his tongue and said, he's already broken, huh? We'll send him away. All of them looked at him for a while and then Valley sent Kokobile away. Valley then turned towards Isami and said, Red Dragon Emperor, Empress, it seems out confrontation has to wait for a while. I hope that you give me a good fight in the future. Suddenly Tatsuya put a hand on Valley's shoulder, making him turn around only to find a smile on Tatsuya's face. Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then said, you see, I don't have any objection if your fight extends only to a spar, but if the spar turns into anything serious, I will make sure that what happened to Kokobile will only looks like a warning to whatever will happen to you. In return, I am promised to fight you every once in a while. Hearing the first part, the only thing that all those who knew what happened to Kokobile gulped their saliva, but after Tatsuya said the second part of the sentence, Valley smirked and nodded his head and then flew back to his Azazel. Tatsuya then looked at others who all sighed and said, so all of this is finally over. Finally, we can relax now. Tatsuya then smiled at them and then said, start working on fixing the area around here. We don't want the normal people to notice the destruction here, now do we? All of them have an annoyed sigh, but still nodded their heads and started maintaining the area around them. Tatsuya, who was sitting under a tree supporting the bodies of Asia, Tia and Sarah because of the shock they just received, though only Asia was seriously shocked while Tiamat and Seraphal were just making an excuse to laze around and cling to Tatsuya. Seeing them, the other girls were sort of jealous of them, but let them do as they pleased. They were worried about Asia, who learned about God's death, and they also didn't know what the other two saw about the three-way war, but one thing was for sure, that they were not willing to know about it. Tatsuya then turned his head and saw an unconscious red-headed girl lying beside her. He looked at Rias for a while and then said, I forgot to release her out of the genjutsu. And then did so, and a few minutes later Rias started to wake up. Tatsuya then turned his head and started caressing the heads of the girls who were using him as a support while sleeping, which made all of them smile unconsciously. Soon Rias got back to her senses and started looking around and then noticed the others working on maintaining the area. Tatsuya then, without even looking at her, said, if you are awake, then go and help the others. Hearing the voice, Rias got surprised and turned her head only to find Tatsuya and the three girls lying near him. She looked at him for a while and then, without saying anything, stood up and started helping the others. Tatsuya, who saw her walking away from him, nodded and thought, so, the princess can be understanding and obedient as well. Hopefully she will start taking things a little bit more seriously from now on, and closed his eyes. Once they were all done, all of them gathered near Tatsuya, who, after checking that everything was done, dispelled the barrier around the area and said, well, let's go back and rest. There was a whole lot of mess we had to face today. All of them nodded and were ready to go back home, but then noticed that the girls were still lying on Tatsuya. Tatsuya was about to use his telekinesis to lift their bodies without disturbing them, but before he was able to, Kurumi came close to him and kicked Tiamat off him and said, wake up, lizard hag. Time to VO back. Tiamat, who was suddenly kicked by Kurumi with a small force behind the kick, immediately woke up and then hatefully looked at Kurumi, who only gave a bright smile to her. Seeing that, Tiamat gritted her teeth and then stood up while clutching her stomach and was about to launch at Kurumi, but both of them immediately stopped when they experienced a huge pressure on their bodies and looked at Tatsuya, who was also smiling at them. Seeing his smile, all of them shuddered and then immediately stood straight. Seeing that, Tatsuya stopped releasing the pressure and said, good, now let's go back for real. All of them nodded, and then Tatsuya lifted both Asia's and Seraphal's bodies with telekinesis and opened a portal to his home. Tatsuya then looked at Sona and asked, so are you taking Sarah back? Before he was able to finish, the magical girl said, of course I am staying with you tonight. I need to hug you a lot to get over the war incident. Tatsuya looked at the magical girl and said, so you finally decided to stop pretending to be asleep, huh? Well, whatever, you coming as well, Sona, Tsubaki. Both of them then nodded and then entered the portal along with the others, leaving behind the Grimoire Peerage along with Zenobia. Chapter 129, Photo Frame. Tatsuya and the others then appeared in his house, and the first thing that came in his sight was an unconscious Irina who was lying on the sofa. Tatsuya looked at Tsubaki and asked, "Did you bring her here directly earlier?" Tsubaki shrugged her shoulders and said, "You once said that your house defenses are the best in the world, so I thought that it would be the safest place to keep her." Tatsuya nodded her head and then stretched his body and said, "Well, do whatever you want. I'm going to take a bath," and then walked away. Soon the others came in as well, but Tatsuya didn't have any problem with that as he was used to seeing them naked. The only ones who were shy and blushing were Sona and Irina, who was now awake. After that, Tatsuya and the others went back to their respective room, and the others were placed in the guest rooms, and all went to sleep. The next morning, after waking up, Tatsuya went downstairs and noticed Irina wearing a formal coat and pants with a briefcase in her hand. He walked towards her and said, "So you were leaving, huh?" Irina turned around and with a helpless smile on her face nodded her head. Tatsuya and Irina kept looking at each other for a while, and then Tatsuya said, "Come back soon." Irina cheerfully nodded her head, but suddenly both of them heard a voice, "Well, I will appreciate if you never come back." And both of them turned around to see Miyuki walking towards them. Miyuki then stood beside Tatsuya and with a smile on her face said, "So, you are going? I feel so sad." But the smile on her face indicated otherwise. Seeing the expression on Miyuki's face, Irina's brows twitched and she said, "Well, if you feel so sad, then I will come back as soon as possible." Miyuki elegantly shook her head and said, No, you should not trouble yourself for our sake." Irina was about to say something, but Miyuki interrupted her and said, "And I cannot be near some trash for long," with the elegance as earlier. Both Tatsuya and Irina looked at her for a while, and then Irina said, "How can you say something like that with such elegance?" Miyuki then placed a hand on her cheek and then once again with her elegance said, "Oh, seems like I forgot that a rowdy person like you cannot understand such a way of speaking." Hearing that, Irina was enraged and was about to lash out at Miyuki, but before she was able to, Miyuki took out something from her storage ring. Miyuki then had a small rectangular box wrapped in some gift wrap in her hand. Tatsuya looked at her and smiled. Irina, who saw the gift in her hand, was surprised and then pointed her finger and herself and said, "For me?" Miyuki nodded her head and with a smile on her face said, "I cannot let you go back empty-handed, right?" Irina took the gift immediately from Miyuki's hands and then hurriedly started opening the gift. Seeing her antics, Tatsuya chuckled while Miyuki only humphed and looked away. Once Irina had opened her gift, it revealed a photo frame with a picture of all the people who were at Shiba residence the night before. Seeing the gift, Irina smiled and then hugged Miyuki and said, "Thank you." Miyuki hugged her for a while and then immediately pushed her away and said, "Don't take advantage of the situation." But this time Irina didn't get angry at her, making Miyuki click her tongue. Tatsuya then took out a box as well and then gave it to Irina and said, "These are some cookies and recipes for Tuji and Grace-san. Please pass them on and tell them I said hi." Irina took the box as well and then said, "I will do it," and then left the house after the taxi that she called for came in front of her house. Once she was gone, Tatsuya looked at Miyuki and said, "You were surprisingly good to her this time." Miyuki only smiled and then went inside the house. Seeing the smile on her face, Tatsuya got a little suspicious and used his telepathy to listen to what Miyuki was thinking and soon sighed and said, "She will never change," and then went inside the house as well. Later that day, all of them then went back to their original lifestyle, with Sarah Fall going back to the underworld and the others back to school. After the school was over, Tatsuya and the others as usual went to the ORC and were greeted by a blue-haired girl wearing the Kuo High uniform. Tatsuya smirked and said, "So you became a devil as well, Zenovia." Zenovia then came forward and slightly bowed her head and said, "It's just as you said, I became a devil as well," and then spread her wings. Rias then came forward and said, "She is now my knight alongside Yudo." Tatsuya gave a thought about it and then said, "I think a rook would have been better since she relies on brute strength rather than speed." Well, whatever, it is not my problem. Hearing what he just said, all the people in the room fell silent and gave a thought about it. Soon Rias sighed and then said, "Why didn't I thought of that earlier?" Tatsuya ignored what she said and then asked, "Did you get the notice?" with seriousness in his voice. Rias turned serious as well and then said, "Yes, I did." She then turned towards her peerage and said, "From now on, Rias Gremory, does not have any authority over Kuo Town, though we have the permission to live and continue our education just as we were doing earlier." The whole Gremory group fell silent, but soon all of them nodded their heads. Zenovia, who was confused about what was happening there, was being filled up on the situation by Asia, whom she had apologized to earlier. Once she got notified what was going on, she nodded her head and thought that what happened was completely logical. Tatsuya and the others then left the ORC as they had nothing better to do, and soon Tatsuya's phone rang and he saw Azazel was calling him. Tatsuya looked at his phone for a while and then picked it up. "Hello." "Hello, Tatsuya. Azazel here. Are you free right now?" "Yeah, I am free." "What happened?" "Good. Can you come at my place for a while? There are some matters that I have to discuss with you about the incident." "Fine. See you later." Tatsuya then ended the call and looked at the others and said, "Azazel has something to discuss with me. You all can go on ahead and do whatever you want." All the girls nodded and then decided to go to a cafe to celebrate of Zenovia joining their group. Tatsuya was about to teleport but then decided to walk towards his destination. Soon Tatsuya came to Azazel's apparent and then entered the house without knocking and opening the door with his magic. Azazel, who just came out from the shower and was covered in a bathrobe, looked at Tatsuya with a deadpan expression and said, "Don't you think that it's rude to enter someone's house without knocking?" Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Stop talking like a teenage girl and get to the point already." Azazel laughed and said, "What's the hurry? Come in and let's drink and play some games for a while." Tatsuya thought for a while and then agreed with his decision. Meanwhile, at Irina's location, Irina was currently sitting in front of her father, who was scolding her for taking such a dangerous mission without even informing him, while Grace was also looking at her while scolding her from time to time. Soon both of them stopped and then sighed, and Tuji said, "You are not allowed to take any missions from now on without telling us beforehand. Do you get it?" Irina then sighed and said, "Fine." But the parents looked at their daughter for a while, and then Grace said, "But to think that both Tatsuya-chan and Miyuki-chan were related to the supernatural and were this strong." Tuji then nodded his head and said, "Yeah, but I am glad he was there, or else I don't think that this idiot daughter of mine would have come back." Soon all of them started discussing about the siblings, and then Irina remembered about the gifts that they gave to her. She then took out the boxes and placed it on the table and said, "Tatsuya gave some cookies and recipes for both of you." Both the parents then smiled and then opened the box of cookies and started eating, and were immediately captivated by the taste. Soon Tuji's sight fell on the photo frame, and he took it in his hand and asked, "Who are all these people? I can identify Tatsuya and Miyuki, but who are the others?" Irina sighed and then said, "They are Tatsuya's girlfriends." Hearing then both Tuji and Grace got shocked, and the frame fell from Tuji's hands. Grace then started chuckling and said, "I did think that he will turn out to be such a person, but to think that he will have so many girls." Irina then shook her head and then said, "There are more of them, but they were not there at that time." Hearing that, Grace again started chuckling. Tuji, who saw the number of girls that Tatsuya had, thought, "Why is life so cruel? Why you have so many beautiful girls and I get this brute?" Suddenly Tuji felt a shiver run down his spine, and he turned his head, saw Grace looking at him with a smile on her face. Seeing the smile on Grace's face, Tuji gulped his saliva and said, "Honey, is something wrong?" Grace continued to smile and then said, "I will see you later." At that moment the only thought that Tuji had was, "I am done for." He then cursed the sofa he was sitting on and then thought, "We will spending the night together, partner." Irina, who saw her parents' antics, sighed and then picked up the photo frame, but immediately some tick marks appeared on her face. On the back of the frame was a message written by Miyuki which said, "My dear Miss Trash, there is something that I want to tell you. Ha ha ha, you are still not in a relationship with Oni Isama, you single, virgin loser." Irina immediately punched the table and then shouted, "That damn bitch." Back in KOH town. At the Shiba residence, Miyuki suddenly sneezed and then said, "Looks like she really liked my gift." Chapter 130, Talk with Azazel. While Tatsuya and Azazel were having a gaming night with some drinks and snacks, the girls were having a party of their own along with Isami, Kaneko, Sona, and her peerage, except Saji. Tatsuya and Azazel were having a match, and when Azazel lost the game, he threw the controller on the floor and shouted, "Fuck this shit. How the hell are you able to win continuously?" Tatsuya silently placed the controller down and said, "Luck, I guess." Azazel pointed on the screen and said, "That's fucking 150 games in a row. Did you fuck Lady Luck herself to get that kind of luck? There is a limit to that." Tatsuya took a gulp of his drink and said, "Well, calm down, and I guess we should discuss what you asked me to come here for." Azazel then sighed, and after a while he calmed down and said, "Well, let's do that. I am tired of losing to you for so long." Tatsuya waved his hand and said, "Let it go, man. Say, how about I let you use astral projection form for an hour?" Hearing that, Azazel perked up and immediately bowed down in front of Tatsuya and said, "Oh, great one. Bless this lowly being with the radiance of astral form." Tatsuya then said, "Oh, this great one accepts your request, you lowly crow." Hearing that, Azazel immediately sat straight and shouted, "Hot springs, here I come." Tatsuya just laughed at his antics and turned serious and said, "So, shall we begin?" Azazel turned serious as well and then started asking questions about the incident that happened in the town. After talking for a while, Azazel was massaging his temples and said, "So you mean to say that there were a total of about 700 fallen angels involved with him, and not only that, nearly 1,000 of stray exorcists as well?" Tatsuya, who had a glass in his hand, took a sip and said, "Well, nearly about that. I am not going to count each and every person that I will kill, right? These numbers are the ones written in the documents I got from various hideouts around the town," and then took out those documents from his storage and placed it in front of Azazel. Azazel then took the documents in his hands and then started to go through them, and after going through them for a while he sighed and said, "I guess I have to match up this list with the one we have at the headquarters to check if there are recent traitors left or not." He then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Can I get a copy of them?" Tatsuya then snapped his fingers, and then immediately a similar bundle of documents appeared on the table. Azazel checked the new bundle for a while, and after confirming that there were no mistakes, nodded and then stored them. He then turned towards Tatsuya and said, "Thanks a lot. You don't know how much these documents are going to help me in the upcoming meeting to prove that Grigori was innocent in this matter." Hearing that, Tatsuya looked at Azazel intently and asked, "What meeting?" Even though he knew that it must be the peace meeting, he still pretended to not know about it. Azazel showed a smile and then started to tell him about the meeting between the three factions and the possibility of forming a peace treaty in the same as well. Tatsuya listened to what Azazel was saying, and after he finished saying all that, Tatsuya said, in simple terms, "You just want to laze around without the fear of war with the two factions while also potentially forming a channel to research on the sacred gear holders among the other two factions. Not a bad idea if I say so myself." Tatsuya then turned serious and said, "But won't it make you the target of the other factions, since the alliance may make them think that you all are scheming to take over the other factions?" Azazel nodded his head and then said, "Yeah, that might pose a problem, so I am thinking of asking the other factions around the world to join the treaty as well, and even if they start to take violent actions dash." Tatsuya sighed and said, "You can still somewhat laze around since there would already be a lot of leaders with other factions to take on the lead. You really planned it very well." Azazel started laughing and then said, "I really like how you can think from the same perspective of me. Yes, I am aiming for that, and this will make me still have some power in my hand, while I may also get a lot of work from my shoulders at the end of the day, though the initial days will be a lot more hectic." Tatsuya snorted and said, "Oh please, I bet that you are planning to shift most of the work to other cadres, don't you? Azazel smiled and said, see, you understand me. Maybe we are connected by the string of fate. And immediately a glass went flying and hit Azazel on the forehead. Azazel then rubbed the place where he got hit, and he said, hey, what was that for? Tatsuya only looked at him with a deadpan expression and said, you were sounding very creepy there, so I brought you back to your senses. Azazel glared at him for a while but soon calmed down and said, well, that is what I am thinking, but it depends on the others, whether they are willing to form the alliance or not. After all, we have been at stalemate for a long time, so there are chances that it may not go as I plan. Tatsuya nodded and said, even if the leaders agree to this, the people of the factions may not like to work with the others, as all of you, for who knows why, have a superiority complex. Azazel nodded and said, well, we will think about it later. He then looked at Tatsuya and asked, so how about you? Tatsuya looked back at Azazel and asked, what? Azazel then said, what are you up for, peace or war? Tatsuya smiled and said, I am not in favor of either. It does not matter to me whether the whole world perishes in a war or not, as long as the ones I care about are not involved. I do not care whatever happens, but cross the line even slightly and dash. Tatsuya just stopped at that and smiled at Azazel. Azazel, who saw his smile, felt a shiver run down his smile and said, you know, you can get a bit scary at times, kid. Tatsuya just laughed and said, that I can get, but you don't have to fear till you do something to piss me off. Azazel immediately shook his head and said, there is no way that I am doing that. I have yet a lot of things to do in life. I have to research a lot of sacred gears, have to watch a lot of porn and all that has been made and will be made. The future, and there are a lot of games that I have not yet played out there as well. Tatsuya looked at him with a deadpan expression and said, you do know that the only useful thing that you are planning to do is research sacred gears, right? Azazel just shrugged his shoulder and then asked, what about you? What are you planning to do in future? Tatsuya just sat back in a more comfortable position and then said, I just want to live a peaceful life with my family in the future. Azazel looked at him with a puzzled expression and asked, if you just want that, what is your power for then? Don't you ever think that you can dominate the whole supernatural world? Tatsuya shook his head and said, that will only make me further away from my peaceful life. And do you truly think that the others will not bother you if you don't have absolute power? See, even Ophis and Great Red don't want to dominate the whole world. Otherwise, do you truly think that you all could survive even a full-powered sneeze from those beings? Azazel just then imagined himself getting killed when either of the dragon gods sneezed at him and immediately shook his head and said, well, that will be totally unsightly. Tatsuya then looked at Azazel and asked, what about you? Have you not ever thought of settling down somewhere and start a family of your own? Azazel also sat back and then said, I did think of it sometimes, but my list for sacred gears made me unable to settle down somewhere without putting my family in danger, so I eventually gave up on that, but it's not like I regret that at all. Because of that, I have experience with all kinds of women, and I am still able to research in the sacred gears without any problems. He then looked at Tatsuya and asked, and what kind of peaceful life are you talking about for so long? Tatsuya looked at him seriously and then said, wake up, eat, sex, and then sleep. Azazel looked at him with a deadpan look on his face and he then said, you are pretty straightforward. But that is also one of the things that I like about you, and it makes hanging out with you fun. Suddenly Azazel immediately remembered something and he asked, hey, what did you do to Kokobeel to make him this broken? We are unable to interrogate him at all. And why is that whenever I ask Valley about this topic, he immediately goes inside his room and ignore me? Tatsuya smiled and said, it is better if you do not know about this. You can get some serious damage. Azazel shrugged his shoulders and said, I have seen a lot in my life, kid. I hardly believe that there will be anything that can give many a serious shock. Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then said, don't blame me, and then sent the memory of the three-way war inside Azazel's head, and just like the others, he got sacrificed in a matter of seconds. Tatsuya looked down on Azazel's corpse on the floor and said, he will not be gaining his consciousness back anytime soon. He then picked up his bag and said, thanks for having me at your home, and then teleported back to his house, leaving behind an unconscious Azazel. Chapter 131. Incident at home. After Tatsuya went home, the scene which welcomed him made his eyes pop out. All the girls who came to his house for the house party were touching each other's chests, feeling the softness and size of each other. Both the girls and Tatsuya were frozen at their places, but soon Tatsuya regained his senses and said, go ahead, carry on what you all are doing. Just think that I am not here. And then sat down in a nearby chair and took out some popcorn from his storage and started intently watching the scene in front of him. Suddenly all the girls from Sona's peerage except for her and Tsubaki fell down on the floor and immediately hugged their bodies and started freaking out. Sona herself was blushing very hard but was not freaking out like the others, while Tsubaki, though had a slight blush on her face, tried to show her curves properly to Tatsuya. Suddenly all the girls from Sona's peerage stood up and all of them said in unison, forget whatever you saw. Tatsuya looked at all of them with a serious face and said, not in a million years. All of them blushed at his response, and then Momo pointed her finger at him and said, you should have at least looked away or feel embarrassed about this. Tatsuya looked at her with a deadpan look and said, and why would a guy who is getting this kind of treatment would do that? And as a gentleman, it is my duty to appreciate the beauty that is presented before me to the full extent. All of them then blushed on being called beautiful, but suddenly got angry when Tatsuya said, so are you going to continue? If not, I am going back to sleep. All of them were about to snap at him when suddenly Miyuki came forward and said, forget about these laid-back virgins, Oni-sama. Do you want to feel mine with your own hands? When the word virgin came out of her mouth, all the girls from Sona's peerage, including Sona herself, felt that an arrow pierced through them. All of them then started glaring at Miyuki, and when Miyuki felt their stare, she turned around and smirked at them. All of them then started gritting their teeth when all of them noticed Tsubaki moving towards Miyuki's direction. All the girls started to discuss among themselves. What is Vice President going to do? I guess she is going to avenge us. Nothing less expected from our vice president. She cannot let someone tread upon our pride. Kaya vice president is so cool. But soon all of them got surprised when Tsubaki completely ignored Miyuki and went past her and stood in front of Tatsuya. She looked at Tatsuya for a while and then took his hand and then started walking away while taking Tatsuya with him. Seeing that all got surprised and Sona asked, "Where are you going, Tsubaki?" Tsubaki looked at Sona and said, "I am going to erase the status of virgin off my record," and then without bothering for their response started walking away while still pulling Tatsuya along with her. Suddenly 4 figures obstructed her path and they said, "Just what do you think you are doing?" Tsubaki looked at the 4 girls who stopped her path and found the 4 Nekishu other than Himari, standing in front of her. Tsubaki looked at them with a serious expression and said, "Just move away from my path." Karen came forward and said, "Like hell that's going to happen. We still have not got our turn and you are trying to get ahead of your senpai." Tsubaki, who was still glaring at her, and said, "I will not repeat again. Just move aside." Suddenly all of them heard a voice and then turned their heads to see Sona walking towards them, and then she said, "If you were talking about senpai and kohai, then I guess I will be the senpai for all of you as I know him earlier than you all did." She then looked at Tsubaki and smiled. Tsubaki, who saw her smile, felt really happy and then said, "Sona, to think that you will take my SI dash." But before she was able to finish, Sona formed a magic circle and blasted Tsubaki away with a stream of water, and then she said, "Like hell you were getting ahead of me," and then immediately tried to take Tatsuya's hand and run away with him but could not get a hold of it. She then turned away and saw that Tatsuya was not standing there. She then started looking all over the room and saw Isami holding Tatsuya's hand while running away with him. Tatsuya looked at the scene taking place in front of him and thought, they all have gone totally nuts, and why am I enjoying this situation so much? He then calmed down and then thought, looks like I have found a new interest of watching the whole world burn. He then turned his head and saw Isami having a weird grin on her face, and on seeing that he was sure that Isami was imagining herself doing the night activities with him. Suddenly Isami and Tatsuya were attacked from all the directions, but because of Tatsuya's training Isami easily evaded while also saving Tatsuya as well. She then looked at Tatsuya and then said, "Don't worry, we will be fucking each other the whole night." She then looked at her attackers and said with determination on her face, "No matter what." Tatsuya looked at Isami with a deadpan expression and thought, this girl has her priority set. And what's with so much determination? The 4 Nekishu who attacked Isami came forward, and then Shizuka came forward and then said, "So this stupid student is getting ahead of yourself." Isami snorted and then said, "You 4 may be better than me in fighting and magic and all, but I can bet it with my life that you all are nowhere close to my knowledge about sex, and that goes for all the people in the room." Suddenly the whole room fell silent, and all of them then started looking at Isami. Suddenly all of them formed a magic circle in their hands, and then all of them said in unison, "Like hell that matters," and started firing at Isami. Isami, who saw all the attacks coming towards her, picked Tatsuya up, who was completely carefree and was simply enjoying the situation happening in the room, and started dodging the attacks while also making her way towards the door. All of them saw what she was doing and started working harder on making her stop, but at last were unable to. Isami, who was now in front of the door, was about to make a victory pose when suddenly a punch came aiming at her stomach and made blow away and crashed to the wall. All the people in the whole room got shocked and then turned their heads towards the person who attacked Isami and saw a white-haired loli standing there with her fist coming out while she was looking down. Kaneko didn't look up and then said in her monotone voice, "Stop bothering Tatsuya-senpai." Tatsuya then looked at Kaneko with a smile on his face and said, "Kaneko-chan." Kaneko then looked up, and once she did, Tatsuya saw a light blush on her face and then smelled something. He then said, "Kaneko-chan, are you drunk?" Kaneko, who looked at Tatsuya and said, **, what are you saying, senpai? I am totally fine." Suddenly Ingvild said, "Yup, she is drunk. She ate a whole box of alcoholic chocolates." Tatsuya looked at her with a deadpan look on his face and then turned towards Kaneko and was about to say something, but before he was able to, Kaneko stumbled on her feet and was about to fall down, but Tatsuya caught her before she was able to. Kaneko then looked at Tatsuya in the eyes and said, "Senpai, I am feeling hot." Tatsuya, who saw the expression on her face, thought of taking her away soon, but controlled his urges and said, "Don't worry, Kaneko-chan, just rest for a while and you will be fine soon." Kaneko then shook her head and said, "Senpai, will you make kitties with me?" "Yeah." And at that moment something inside Tatsuya snapped and he said, "I don't care whether I will be in the jail tomorrow or not," and was about to walk away. But before he was able to leave the room, Kurumi and Ingvild grabbed his shoulders and said, "But we do. Now give her to me." Tatsuya was then brought back to his senses and then immediately gave place to Kaneko in Kurumi's hands. All the girls looked at him with a weird expression on their faces, and noticing their gazes, Tatsuya looked back at them and said, "I know that I have said this earlier, but I will say it again. I don't regret any of it." All of them kept staring at him for a while, and then Isami approached him and silently took his hand and again started moving towards the door. Seeing that all of them came back to their senses and again started attacking each other. While this was happening, Sona's peerage looked at the scene in front of them with a deadpan look on their faces, and then Momo said, "How did any of this started?" Suddenly they heard a voice, and all of them turned their heads and saw Tatsuya sitting on the sofa with some popcorn in his hands while watching the scene in front of him. Tatsuya then said, "You were spouting something earlier about looking at you all or something. By the way, are you all going to do that again? If not, I am going back to my room to sleep." Suddenly all of their lips twitched, but all of them thought, how can a person be so shameless? Chapter 132. 3, not 2. While the girls were still having their dispute, Tatsuya noticed that there was no chances of them doing anything, and so he went back to his room silently without making anyone notice him and went to sleep. The next morning when he woke up and came down, he was completely freaked out. All the girls were lying on the floor here, and they're looking just like corpses, and all the furniture in the room was totally devastated. He had some veins popping out on his forehead, and he said, "Wake up, girls, it's morning already." But the girls only squirmed in their places with no intention of waking up. Seeing that Tatsuya sighed, but then an idea came to his mind, he said, "The one who wakes up last will have the smallest breasts." And immediately all of them stood up straight, with the first one being Kaneko. All of them blinked their eyes in surprise for a while, and then all of them gave a hateful glare to Tatsuya. Tatsuya just ignored them, and then glared back at them and said, "I don't know how you do it, but I want my house fixed back like it was within an hour. Do you understand?" All of them shivered at his glare, and then immediately nodded their heads and started working on maintaining all the areas that they destroyed last night. After an hour, all the girls were breathing heavily and were drenched in sweat. Sona cleaned her glasses and then put them back and said, "My respect for the housemaids of the Citri mansion has now increased by a very great extent." Hearing her, the rest of her peerage nodded their heads as well. Suddenly the door of the room opened and revealed Tatsuya coming in there with a tray with some drinks. He then looked around the room and said, "Nice work, girls. I didn't expect that you all would be able to do it within an hour. Here, take these iced tea as refreshment." All the girls immediately gathered around Tatsuya and took a glass each from the plate and started gulping down the drink. Tatsuya didn't say anything and let them all relax a bit, and once he noticed that they all caught their breath, Tatsuya asked, "So what did you learn from all this?" All of them didn't even take a second and answered, "To never make a ruckus in someone else's house, and maids are the greatest." Tatsuya looked at them with a weird look on his face and said, "You were right about the first part, but for the second one, don't you know that the ones who are the greatest are not maids, but cat-eared maids?" After he said that, he gave a fake cough and then looked at Sona and said, "On that account, are you willing to help me in the restaurant just like the last time, but this time being in maid uniform with cat ears? Ah, just imagining about that makes my heart flutter." He then grabbed Sona's hand, taking her aback by surprise. He then closed the distance between their faces, making her face blush even more, and he then looked in her eyes and said, "Sona, will you do that for me?" Sona, who was completely flustered by his actions, absent-mindedly nodded her head, and seeing her acting like that, Tatsuya smiled and kissed her lips. He soon separated himself and said, "Thank you in advance," and then left the room. After Tatsuya left the room, all of them still kept on looking the absent-minded Sona, and then Rhea asked, "What happened to her?" Tsubaki snorted and said, "Her brain must have been fucked up because all that happened right now. She must be imagining herself being married to Tatsuya and then living together with him with her 2 children in a small house surrounded by the forest or something." At her words, Sona came back to reality and said, "Hey, we have 3 kids, not 2. At this, all of them looked at her with a deadpan expression, making her feel embarrassed, and then she covered her face with her hands, and she then said, "Just let me die." But just as she said that, all of them heard a voice, and then they turned around to see Tatsuya sitting on a chair while drinking some iced tea. Tatsuya then said, "If you die, what will happen to the 3 children of ours?" Tatsuya said that and then had a small grin on his face, making Sona blush even harder. Suddenly Isami interrupted all of them and said, "Seriously, right now when we just finished the work?" All of them then looked at Isami waiting for answers, but Kaneko beat her to that and said, "President Rias has asked to come to the school pool for the annual cleanup." All of the girls then made an O face, and then Sona said, "Oh, yeah, the Rias asked to let the ORC do this job so that they can enjoy the pool after it is cleaned." Tatsuya then said, "Then why don't we all go there and enjoy the pool as well? I mean, it's actually very hot today." All the girls in Sona's peerage nodded, and they looked expectantly at Sona, waiting for confirmation. Sona was a bit hesitant on the matter because according to the school rules they were technically not allowed to do so, but feeling the gazes full of expectations on herself made her decision waver. Feeling the hesitation in Sona's thoughts, Tatsuya was about to say something to her, but Tsubaki then came forward and said, "Just agree to it already. We all have worked up quite a sweat, and the pool will be a great way to get the heat off. I cannot let the opportunity to enchant Tatsuya with my swimsuit pass. I have to make my king agree to it by any means." Sona looked at her queen and then said, "But Tsubaki, doing that will be going against the school rules, and as the student council we cannot do that." Tsubaki kept her calm and then said, "But before the student council we are also teenagers, and it is a teenager's job to enjoy their time with his friends, right? Just agree, you stupid king of mine. You are getting an opportunity as well." Sona, who was still confused about what to do, was taken out of her thoughts by Tatsuya, who said, "Why don't you agree, Sona? They all are willing to do so, and won't Rias and her peerage will be doing the same as well. Plus dash." He then got silent for a while and then said, "I really want to see you wearing a swimsuit," and smiled at her, making her blush. Sona then gave a fake cough and said, "I guess I can look over this matter for once, but don't you get habitual to this." All the girls from her peerage nodded in excitement and then started going towards their homes to get their swimsuit. Tatsuya then walked towards Tsubaki and then stood beside her and said, "Of course I want to see you in one as well," and gave a slight peck on the lips and then walked away. Tsubaki, who was completely stunned by her actions, stood there motionless. Makiji Sona, and the girls of Tatsuya's team look at her with a weird expression on their faces, and Sona asked, "What happened to her?" Kurumi gave a slight chuckle and said, "She is now in her own world of living with Tatsuya in a small house surrounded by the forest with their 2 children in their home." Tsubaki then snapped out of it and then said, "Hey, we have 3 kids, not 2. Chapter 133, Swimming Pool, 1. After everyone was ready with their preparations, all of them then gathered at the school and then started walking towards the pool. When they reached the pool, the remaining Grimory group was surprised by the sudden appearance of the student council, except Saji and Tatsuya's group. Tatsuya then looked at Rias, raised his hand and said, "Yo." Rias looked at him for a while and then looked at Sona and asked, "What happened for the student council to be here?" Sona hesitated for a bit and said, "We came here to enjoy the pool as well." At this statement, Rias widened her eyes and said, "You want to do something that causes breaking of the rules?" Sona shifted her gaze and said, "Don't misunderstand. I only came here because the others were willing to, so I had to tag along with them." At this, Tsubaki came forward and said, yes, what Sona is saying is true. She is just tagging along because we were willing to enjoy the pool. Sona then turned her head and looked at Tsubaki with a grateful gaze which crumbled instantly when Tsubaki said, she is not going to wear a swimsuit and will sit out of the pool and will only watch over us. She then turned her head and with a smirk on her face said, right, President? Sona had various tick marks on her forehead and she said, yes, what Tsubaki is saying is true. Seeing them, Tatsuya sighed and came forward and gave a chop on both Sona's and Tsubaki's head and said, stop teasing Sona. Only I am allowed to do that. And Sotan, try to be honest with yourself. Both of them looked at him with a pout on their faces on seeing which Tatsuya only smiled. Tatsuya then looked at the Gremory group and said, simply said we came here to enjoy the pool once it is clean. Ria smiled and said, that's all right, the more the merrier. Tatsuya nodded and said, good, now get back to cleaning and do it fast, it is very hot out here, and then placed his stuff down and laid back on a chair. Seeing him, the others who came with him except for Isami and Kaneko did the same as well. The Gremory group looked at them with a speechless expression and then Ria said, aren't you all going to help? Tatsuya looked at her with a weird look on his face and said, and why would we? Isn't it the ORC's job to clean the pool? Hearing his shameless but true answer, Ria gritted her teeth and said, how much shameless can you get? Tatsuya just smiled and said, hurry up, we don't have the whole day. Ria glared at him for a while but soon sighed and said, whatever, let's just finish work soon. Akino looked at Rias and said, Rias, I think that I forgot my swimsuit at home. I will go and fetch it quickly, and immediately made a magic circle and teleported herself without even waiting for Rias's answer. Akino suddenly appeared in an alley and said, Era, if I knew that Tatsuya-kun was coming I would have chosen a good swimsuit. Well, it's not too late anyway, and then came out of the alley and in front of a swimsuit store and went inside. Meanwhile in the school, Rias and the remaining Gremory group were scrubbing the floor of the pool while Tatsuya was instructing them. Move your hands quickly. What kind of knight you're, Kiba? Use your speed. Rias scrubbed the corners as well, and don't lag behind the others. Isami, boost your physical abilities and start working faster. Kaneko-chan, wear these cat ears first, and then start cleaning, and then threw a pair of them towards Kaneko. Kaneko stopped working for a while and stared at the thing which Tatsuya threw at her for a while. Suddenly an idea came to her, and then she put the ears in her head and thought, time to use Nico power. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, Senpai, it is too much work for me, Nya, can you please help me, Naya? And then made a pose. Tatsuya got silent for a while and then used his magic to clean the pool immediately and then started using his water magic to fill the pool with water. All the girls, and Kiba, gathered around Kaneko and said, good job, Kaneko-chan. Kaneko, who still had the emotionless face, said, no problem, and then took off her ears and placed it back on her chair. Tatsuya looked at the group and then said, work's done, let's get changed. All of them then looked at the clean and fresh water the pool and then nodded their heads and then started walking towards the changing room. Suddenly a magic circle appeared and Akino came out of it and said, I hope that I didn't take long. And then looked at the pool and said, you guys already did the work so fast? Ria shook her head and said, no, Tatsuya just lost to the cats, which made Akino confused but she shrugged it off, not caring about it. All the girls then went inside the changing rooms and then Tatsuya looked at Kiba and said, let's get going. Kiba nodded his head and then went together with Tatsuya. Chapter 134, Swimming Pool, 2. After Tatsuya and Kiba went inside the changing room and both of them started taking off their clothes. Tatsuya felt Kiba intently looking at him. Tatsuya turned around and said, what happened? Don't tell me that you suddenly started having feelings towards me. And even if that is true, I am really sorry, I cannot accept you. First, I am totally straight, and second, even if by some miracle you turn female, I only see you as my friend. Kiba looked at him with a weird expression on his face and said, dude, you hit your head somewhere, or what? There is no way I have feelings for you. Tatsuya sighed and said, I am relieved to hear that. So what is in your mind? Kiba stayed silent for a while and then said, I would like to thank you for the help you offered during the whole this incident. Even if you were not related to it, you still helped me a lot. So I want to thank you for that, and I promise that whenever you need my help, I will gladly help you. Tatsuya just smiled and said, no need to sound overdramatic. I helped you because I didn't want one of my female friends to die, or worse, become a mindless killer. So don't sweat it too much. Kiba, who heard him, smiled as well and then said, but what I said about help still stands. Just ask me, and I am even willing to sacrifice my body for you. Tatsuya looked at him with a weird look on his face and said, that sounds way too gross. Pervert. Kiba twitched his lips but didn't said anything, but soon as if Tatsuya realized something he smiled and said, I know one way that you can offer your body. Kiba looked at the expression on his face and said, did you suddenly awakened a new desire of making males dress up like cat girls? This time it was Tatsuya's turn to twitch his lips and say gee, that Kiba smirked and then said, I have been learning quite a lot from you. Tatsuya snorted and said, yeah, whatever. Now what I was saying was that you can offer your body by sometimes working in the restaurant to attract a lot of female customers there. Oh, and since you want to wear cat ears so much, we can do that as well. It will only increase the profit. Tatsuya then turned serious and said, and don't underestimate this world. I have faced off against an enemy who can turn others into lowly cat girls with his invention, even men as well. Somewhere in a place full of people whose bodies were slightly transparent, a person can be seen wearing a lab coat working on something. Suddenly the person sneezed and he said, who the hell is remembering me even after I am dead? Did someone find my collection of lowly magazines in my drawer? Suddenly the door was opened and a person came inside and said, Nabiriya-sama, did something happen? The said person shook his head and said, nothing, just thought that someone was remembering me. The one who asked the question shrugged his thoughts on the matter and asked, is the lowly maker ready yet? Nabirius looked at the person and said, "Not yet. I am still not able to make it work on the souls of the people present here. It just passed through them." He then slumped his shoulders but soon became determined and said, "But I will not give up. I will definitely complete this device and make the people acknowledge me, Databayo." Hearing his determined tone, the other person became spirited as well and said, "Yes, we will make this place, lowly soul world." Suddenly the door was knocked, and then they heard the words which scared the shit out of them. "FBI, open up." Suddenly the research facility was broken from various places and many armed people who had transparent bodies as well came and pointed their guns at the two people in there. Seeing the armed people surrounding them, the device that Nabirius was holding fell from his hand and hot destroyed after crashing on the ground. Seeing their dreams literally shatter in front of them, the two people fell on their knees and shouted, "Oh, oh, oh." But the armed men didn't care about that, and one of them said, "Catch them and lock him up." All of them nodded and then restrained the two of them. Kiba looked at Tatsuya in disbelief and then said, "Stop spouting nonsense, there's no way that's true." Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then took a box out of his storage and then took the lid off the box to reveal a gun-shaped device. Tatsuya looked at Kiba with a serious expression and said, "What you are seeing in front of you is the device which I was talking about. Want to try it?" Seeing the seriousness in Tatsuya's eyes, Kiba knew that Tatsuya wasn't joking around. He fell silent for a moment until something clicked in his mind and he asked, "By the way, why are you carrying it instead of destroying it?" Tatsuya immediately covered the box back and averted his gaze and said, "Research purposes. Anyway, leave it. We are getting late." Kiba looked at his friend with a deadpan look on his face, but suddenly his gaze shifted and fell on Tatsuya's member and his lips immediately started twitching and he thought, "Why the world is so unfair?" Chapter 135, Swimming Pool, 3. After both Tatsuya and Kiba came out of the changing room, and the sight which welcomed Tatsuya made him completely speechless, and the only thought that came to his mind was, somehow this looks even better than they are completely naked. Tatsuya's gaze then traveled through each of his girls, making them all blush, and then Tatsuya gave an appreciative nod and said, "Yup, all of you look absolutely stunning." All of them smiled at his response and then went with each other to enjoy the pool. Suddenly Tatsuya felt a rather soft sensation on his back, and without even turning around he asked, "What happened to Kino-san?" Akino gave a fufu laugh and then said, Era, does Tatsuya-kun recognize me so well to know who is behind you without even looking?" Tatsuya turned around and shrugged his shoulders and said, "Isn't it obvious? We have been around each other for a rather long time, either in the club or battles. It is easy for me to recognize your presence when you are around." Akino just smiled and then said, "So Tatsuya-kun, how am I looking?" and did a pose which made her curves even more stand out. Tatsuya wanted to say that what she was wearing could hardly be called a swimsuit, but keeping that to himself he said, "Well, I guess this rather suits you. You look very beautiful in it," and gave a smile. Akino, who was expecting Tatsuya to blush or have a lewd look or thoughts about her appearance, was totally surprised when she didn't find either of the two coming from Tatsuya, and instead of making him blush, she started blushing herself on receiving the honest comment from Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who saw Akino spacing out in front of him, waved his hand in front of her eyes, making her snap out of her trance. On seeing that Akino came back to her senses, Tatsuya said, "Well, we should get going and enjoy the pool first. We can talk some time later as well," and started walking towards the pool when suddenly Akino grabbed one of his hands and put it in between her breasts and said, "Yes, let's go," and started pulling him. Tatsuya, who was being pulled by Akino, didn't mind that and shrugged his shoulders and let himself get dragged by her, and also he was liking the feeling of being enclosed by the softness of Akino's breasts. On seeing Tatsuya and Akino coming together towards the pool, the Tatsuya's group and some other girls were slightly jealous by her, but let them be. They didn't want to ruin the mood of everyone as they all came to enjoy the pool and decided to deal with it later. Tatsuya and Akino were about to enter the pool when suddenly Kaneko came towards the two of them and said, "Senpai, can you teach me how to swim?" with an evident blush on her face. Tatsuya then looked towards Akino, who, understanding the meaning of the gaze, released his hand and said, "Teach her well, but I will have you spend some time with me later." Tatsuya just sighed and nodded his head. He then looked at Kaneko and patted her head and said, "Sure, let's get going, Kaneko-chan," making the already blushing Kaneko even more flustered, but she still nodded her head. Tatsuya then went with Kaneko towards the shallow end of the pool and started her teaching how to swim while holding her hands. Tatsuya kept looking at her to make sure to not let something happen to her because of his mistake. But for the white-haired Nekishu, who noticed Tatsuya gaze continuously at her, was feeling very embarrassed by it, but knowing that he was only looking at her out of concern, didn't say anything. When Tatsuya came at the edge of the pool, he suddenly stopped, making Kaneko crash into him, but he caught her. Tatsuya then looked at Kaneko and said, "I think that this much must be enough for now, so shall we take a break?" Kaneko looked at Tatsuya and nodded her head. Tatsuya then picked her up, much to her surprise, and then got out of the pool and placed her on the ground. Tatsuya then looked at her once again and patted her head and said, "You did well. I think you will be able to swim soon enough," and then started walking away, leaving behind a slightly embarrassed Kaneko. Tatsuya then sat on a chair and then gave a deep sigh and said, "Finally, some chance to rest. There have been a lot going around the town recently." He then stretched his body and then lied down on a chair and closed his eyes. After some time, Tatsuya, who was just lying down comfortably, suddenly felt someone standing in front of him, and so he opened his eyes to see a red head standing in front of him. Tatsuya looked at the person for a while and then asked, "What happened, Karen? Need something from me?" Karen just smiled and said, "Would you mind rubbing the suntan on me?" and took out a bottle from who knows where. Tatsuya looked at the bottle for a while and then said, "Sure, lie down." Karen continued to smile and then lied down on her stomach and took off her top and said, "Be gentle, okay," in a sultry voice. Tatsuya, who heard her voice, just smirked and then put the cold liquid directly on her back, making her give out a shriek. Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Don't worry, I will be gentle," and started applying the tan all over her body, making her give out moans of pleasure which made all the girls around them blush. When Tatsuya was done, all the Karen was left unconscious and had a satisfied expression on her face, and seeing that she was sleeping, Tatsuya sighed and tied her top back at her and covered her body to not let her catch cold. Tatsuya then looked around and saw him surrounded by the girls, all of whom were holding a bottle of suntan. Tatsuya, who understood what they all wanted, sighed. Kiba had already left the pool and went somewhere to get a drink for himself, leaving Tatsuya all by himself. Tatsuya then looked at his group along with Sona, Tsubaki, and Isami and said, "Just lie down and don't make any ruckus about not dealing with someone first. Otherwise, I am not doing it." All of them sighed but still nodded their heads and then lied down and let Tatsuya do his work, and just like with Karen, all of them had a satisfied expression on their faces and were sleeping blissfully. While Tatsuya was rubbing the oil on their bodies, he was surprised as even the girls from Sona's peerage along with Rias, Akino, and Kaneko came as well, and since he was doing it for the others, he decided to do it for them as well. Tatsuya, who was finally done with his work, sat back and looked at the girls. His gaze then landed on Akino, and then he thought, "I guess I should tell her now." While he was in his thoughts, Rias, who was still not asleep, looked at Tatsuya, who was busy thinking something, and started walking towards him. Tatsuya, who noticed someone coming towards him, came out of his thoughts and asked, "Want something, princess?" Rias shook her head and silently sat beside him. Tatsuya didn't give it much thought and just continued to think about some things that he had to do. Suddenly Rias looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Tatsuya, do you think that I am an irresponsible king?" Tatsuya, who clearly heard her question, didn't hesitate for a bit and said, "Yup." Seeing how bluntly and quickly he answered, Rias got disappointed. Tatsuya looked at her and said, "You are very irresponsible, and I think I don't need to tell you about all the irresponsible things that you have done, the latest being the management of my territory." He waited for her to respond, and then he saw her nodding her head. Tatsuya nodded as well. "Your only good traits are that you treat your peerage kindly and have a lot of innate potential, but your bad traits completely turns your situation to negative. You are not a hard worker and very arrogant, and that is what leads you to your downfall." Rias, who heard his words, felt like something was piercing her, but she didn't refute it this time. She had thought a lot about what Tatsuya told her previously, and the more she thought about that, the more she felt that she was in the wrong. She then gave a sigh and said, "Do you think I can improve?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Only you can answer that question," and stood up and started walking away. Rias looked at Tatsuya's back and said, "Where are you going?" Tatsuya didn't even turn around and said, "Washroom," and continued to walk. Soon he came in front of the washroom, and he then took out his phone to call someone. After he was done talking, he ended the call and started walking back, but suddenly he encountered Zenovia on his way and said, "Where were you all this time?" Zenovia turned around and saw Tatsuya standing in front of her and said, "Oh Tatsuya, it was my first time wearing a swimsuit, so it took longer than I expected to wear it. So how do I look?" Tatsuya looked at her from top to bottom and said, "You look gorgeous in it, but don't you think that it is slightly on the revealing side for someone who was a follower of the church not so long ago? But thinking about the outfit that you wore as an exorcist, I think this one is more normal." Zenovia nodded her head and said, "I just wanted to try the things that I wanted, not something based on what the others wanted me to do, something that the church taught as while serving under the Lord." Tatsuya nodded and thought, "I learned something new about the ways of the church." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Well, it is natural to have desires." She then walked closer to Tatsuya, making him a bit confused by her actions, and then she said, "Tatsuya, there is something that I want your help with." Tatsuya, who now somewhat understood what she wanted to ask for, nodded his head and said, "First tell me what you want, and then I will think about it." Zenovia nodded and said, "I want to have your children." Tatsuya, who heard the answer he was expecting, looked at her with a neutral face and then said, "And who filled your head with such idiocy?" Zenovia was a bit surprised by his comment and said, "No, it is not something that someone else told me about. I wanted to do this of my own free will." She then paused for a while and then said, "Just like I told you earlier, while I was working for the church, we were not allowed to do things that we desired, and we simply locked all those desires inside our hearts. But now when I am given the chance to act according to my desires, I want to dash." Tatsuya interrupted her and said, "You want to experience something that only a girl can," and decided to give birth to a child. Hearing him, Zenovia looked at him with a diligent expression on her face and nodded her head. Seeing the sincerity on her face, Tatsuya sighed and said, "I don't know whether to praise you for your sincerity or hit you for your idiocy," and started massaging his temples. He then looked at Zenovia and said, "Did you even think about what your actions might lead to?" Seeing that no response was coming from her, his brows were twitching, and he then said, "First of all, let's presume you somehow got pregnant. Do you think that you will be able to enjoy your school life, which you have just came to experience in that situation?" This made her shocked, and she then started thinking about what might happen if she do get pregnant. Tatsuya didn't wait for her, and then said, "Second, you are asking someone whom you have not met even for a week to have children with you. Are you really that stupid? What if the person didn't have a good personality and would not have even helped you to not even take care of the child? And don't tell me that you were planning to take care of the child on your own." At this, Zenovia didn't respond and only looked in Tatsuya's eyes. Tatsuya sighed and said, "So you were planning that without even considering for your partner's feelings?" Zenovia immediately shook her head and said, "No, it's not like that. If you were to say that you were all right with taking care of the child along with me, then I would have done so, but if not, then I was planning to take care of it myself." Tatsuya then said, "Of course I will take care of the child and the mother. After all, I will never have a child with someone whom I am not in love with, and I can easily say that right now I have no feelings for you like that. I only consider you my friend for now." At this, Zenovia got a bit depressed and slumped her shoulders, and seeing that, Tatsuya patted her head and said, "Don't treat either yourself or your partner as a breeding stock. Once you find a person that you like, you will come to a stage together when you both will want to have a child. It should not be because of you wanting to try something that a girl does. Zenobia looked at Tatsuya with a confused expression and asked, what does that mean? Tatsuya just smiled and ruffled her hair and said, you will understand one day. Now let's go. You don't want to let the opportunity to enjoy with the others at the pool go waste, right? And then started walking towards the pool. Zenobia, who was looking at Tatsuya's back, touched her hair where he patted her for a while and then started walking towards the pool, thinking of understanding what Tatsuya told her later. Chapter 136, Identity. After all of them were done playing around and relaxing, all of them decided to go back to their home as it was getting quite late. Tatsuya and his group decided to stop by a few places before going back as the girls wanted to hang out for a bit longer with the others. Tatsuya, who himself was quite tired from all the things that have been happening, complied easily and was alone on his way back home. He had been casually walking on the road while simply enjoying the calm around him. He then stared in the sky and thought, this week must have been the most stressful one I ever had after coming to this world. All the things are occurring back to back without any huge gap in between them. First the exorcists, then Kokobile, and now I think it is the time for the open house and the peace treaty after that. Seriously, this is too much for me. And why the hell all of these things have to take place in Kuo? They can choose any other popular location to do their stuff. Suddenly Tatsuya got alert as his instincts started to warn him. He got in a defensive stance to look out for any attack that was aimed at him, but what Tatsuya noticed was only a magic circle that appeared under him. Tatsuya could have easily got away from the circle, but after feeling the amount of power that circle was giving and also the formation of a very strong barrier around him, Tatsuya got a bit curious and decided to meet the person who was inviting him. Suddenly the light coming from the circle started glowing brighter and brighter, and soon Tatsuya vanished from the spot and everything in the surrounding turned back to normal. Tatsuya, who was suddenly teleported from the Kuo town, appeared in a place which Tatsuya found to be endless. The whole space around him was colored differently and he thought that it was kind of beautiful on its own. Suddenly he felt that the atmosphere around him was trying to crush him, so without wasting any time he formed a barrier around him. After forming the barrier, he started to look around to find the person who invited him but was not able to find anyone. He then decided to sense the area around him to search for any life signals, but just as he did that he felt an enormous amount of energy coming towards him. This was the second time Tatsuya thought that the being coming towards him was powerful, the first one being Ophis, and then suddenly something clicked his mind and he understood who invited him and where he was at. He then looked around once again and then said, so this is the infamous dimensional gap, huh? He then removed some of the limiters on his body and then said, and you must be the one who invited me here, right? And then turned around to see a huge red western dragon with a large horn on his snout and golden eyes. The dragon, who was moving towards Tatsuya, suddenly stopped on his tracks when he noticed the power that Tatsuya was releasing and also got ready for any attacks that might come his way. The dragon then looked at Tatsuya and said, indeed, I am the one who called you here. I am Great Red, and this is my home, the dimensional gap. Tatsuya looked at the dragon curiously for a while and then asked, and what might be the reason for the dragon of dragons to call me here? I don't think that I have done anything to earn the privilege to meet you. The dragon looked at Tatsuya for a while, trying to gauge his strength, but the only thing that it was able to perceive was the human in front of it was dangerous. The dragon then said, I called you here because I was curious. At this, Tatsuya made a confused expression on his face and asked, curious? The dragon nodded its head and said, yeah, I am curious. Why am I not able to read you? Tatsuya felt silent for a while and was thinking, what the hell did the dragon ask him just now? Not being able to understand what the dragon meant, Tatsuya said, and what do you mean by reading me? Be a bit more clear. The dragon then said, what I mean to say is, why am I not able to read your mind or your dreams? Though Tatsuya understood what the dragon was trying to ask, but still didn't know what was the answer to the question. Tatsuya looked at dragon with a questioning gaze and then asked, and why should you be able to read my mind? The dragon looked at the human in front of him for a while and then thought, is this human an idiot or what? Tatsuya, who clearly heard what the dragon was thinking, had some tick marks on his forehead and then said, you are quite a wide one to think that I am an idiot even after you called me here without my permission. The dragon's eyes widened a bit and it asked, you were able to read my thoughts? How? This is impossible. Even the person who was supposed to have the best mind-reading abilities was not able to read my thoughts. So how does a human like you were able to read my thoughts? Tatsuya looked at the dragon with an expressionless face and then said, fuck you. That's how? The dragon, who heard the answer to his question, became a bit pissed, but for living over millions of years it composed itself because of its experience, and the dangerous feeling that Tatsuya was giving was a reason as well. The dragon then said, can you be a bit more serious and answer my questions? Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, how am I supposed to know why you were not able to hear my thoughts, and I was able to hear your thoughts because I was able to? Great Red then said, you do know that it doesn't answer any of my questions, right? Tatsuya simply shrugged his shoulders and said, like I care about that? The dragon, who seemed to have getting more and more pissed, and asked, you know you are a very rude person. Tatsuya simply smiled and said, thanks, I am very proud of it myself. The dragon started to release his aura energy to make the human in front of him scared a bit, but to its surprise Tatsuya was completely fine by the pressure that the dragon was releasing. Tatsuya looked at the dragon with a bored expression and said, if you are done with that, retract your aura, it will not make any difference. The dragon got even more curious about Tatsuya and did as he told. Tatsuya then nodded and said, good, how about you answer some of my questions, since we are not able to find the answers to any of yours? The dragon thought for a while and then said, ask away, there is nothing better to do anyway. Tatsuya nodded and asked, why does Ophis want to kick you out of here? Dragon looked at him for a while and then said, well, that is an interesting question. You do know that both Ophis and I were beings that were originally created in the dimensional gap, right? Tatsuya nodded his head and said, yeah, I know that. The dragon nodded and said, You see, the first one out of us to exist was Ophis, and she was the only one live in the gap because at that time the only concept that the world had was infinite, as nothing other than the void existed at her time. But slowly the life began to evolve on various realms other than the gap, and soon beings capable of thinking started to appear on the surface of various realms, giving the concept of thought and dream, and because of the influence of those thoughts and dream, my existence came into existence as I embodies the concept of the dream. The dragon fell silent for a while and then said, "You know, the aura you give out is not of a person of any realm I know of. Who are you really?" Tatsuya looked at the dragon for a while, completely speechless, when suddenly an idea came in his mind and he said, "My identity? I, the supreme being of reincarnation. The name is Truckkoen." Chapter 137, Great Red. After Tatsuya said those words, Great Red stared at the human in front of it in silence and said, "Quit joking and tell me who you really are. There is no way that you are Truckkoen. He never reincarnated himself. He only do it for others, and there is also the fact that you don't have his aura. Also, I banned anyone sent by him to reincarnate in this universe." Tatsuya looked at the dragon in front of him in surprise and asked, "You banned him from reincarnating others in this universe? Why?" Great Red gave out an annoyed groan and said, "Many of the people he sent here to reincarnate were trying to take over my body, and since they are all souls, it gets very annoying to deal with them. So I simply sealed off the dimension for others to come over here." Tatsuya, who heard what the dragon just said, got in a deep thought. If the dimension is sealed, how the hell was I able to reincarnate in this universe? Don't tell the one who sent me here is even a higher level being than the legendary Truck. Suddenly a paper appeared out of nowhere and landed in Tatsuya's hands. Tatsuya then looked at the paper carefully and found out that it was a message from the being itself. "Hey Tatsuya. How have you been? The wish giver here. Hope you are enjoying there. I just saw your interaction with the dragon there, and I was laughing my ass off at that. And yeah, I am a higher level entity than that damn Truck. Seriously, he makes my work so much difficult. I have to organize another set of documents just for the people he sent to another worlds. Well, let's leave it at that. Make sure to not let the dragon know of your origin. It cannot read your mind because of my powers, but the aura you have can still be seen by such an old being. Make up some excuse or something. Bye." Tatsuya then simply put the paper in his storage and looked directly in the dragon's eyes. The dragon looked back at Tatsuya, waiting for him to answer. Both of them kept staring at each other for a while, and then Tatsuya said, "Stop staring, it's getting creepy," which made the dragon slump its head dramatically. The dragon looked back at the human and said, "You human, answer me first, and stop screwing around." Tatsuya looked at the dragon with an expressionless face and said, "How would I know? I have only been to 3 realms till now, Earth, Underworld, and Takamagara. How am I supposed to know where I belong from? I have been living in Earth till now. If someone is old as you cannot tell, how the hell will I know?" The dragon, who heard Tatsuya's answer, thought for a bit and said, "That seems justifiable. How can someone like you know if even I don't know? And I literally can see through the minds of all, except yours, of course." Tatsuya inwardly sighed and then said, Yeah, well, does it really matter? I think that it must be some kind of mutation, that my aura must be different." The dragon nodded his head and said, "It might be possible. Well, just leave it at that." So where was I? Like I was saying, that my creation took place after that of Ophis, but the fact is that Ophis was not here at the time of my creation. Though I am a bit thankful for that, because there might be a chance that Ophis could have destroyed me even before I could have been created. Well, since I got in the dimensional gap, I started roaming around here and there, so my power was not stagnant at a location, and also because of some characteristics of the void here, which even I am not able to explain. My presence was not detected by Ophis at all. But soon, when she came back to the gap and saw me, she thought that I invaded her home in the time that she was not here. I even explained her that I was born here, but since she was not able to sense my power in the gap during the time she was not here, she didn't believe me, but she still let me live here at that time. We both were living here without even bothering each other, or so I thought. Apparently my constant drives around the gap caused a lot of disturbances in the gap, which annoyed her a lot, and soon she started fighting over the possession over the gap. But since I was stronger than her, she was not able to defeat me, so I stayed in the gap. I even told her that I have no problem living together with her, but she said that she was not able to get her silence here anymore. Tatsuya, who was now sitting over the dragons, had heard the whole story carefully and then said, "Then the whole problem with her originated from a single misunderstanding." The dragon nodded its head and said, "Yeah." Tatsuya thought for a while and asked, "Do you ever try talking to her? I mean, other than the serious talk, like talking to her like friends or family?" At this the dragon fell silent and then after a while said, "No, I don't think that I ever did that. She never have thoughts and do most of the things on a whim, and there is also the fact that I cannot hear her thoughts, as her being the embodiment of infinite have some perks of their own." Tatsuya sat back comfortably on the head and said, "Well, I think if you have done that, you two could have lived together. She is just lonely. I have met her a lot of times, and all the times our interactions have been a lot of fun." Both Tatsuya and Great Red then fell silent. Tatsuya then caressed on the dragon scale and said, "You know, your scales are very soft and comfortable. Don't you think that they are bad for defense?" The dragon shook its head and said, "Nope, despite they are soft, they are still unbreakable up to a very high extent. Though I think that you might be able to break it at your full power." Tatsuya just nodded and then asked, "Don't you get bored living here all the time?" The dragon sighed and said, "Well, it's a bit boring, but it cannot be helped. If I step in the other mortal realms for a long time, the beings there will start having various problems. This is something that I am jealous of Ophis. She is able to step into other realms without bothering others, whereas for me that is not possible. My presence will hamper their senses and many problems will arise for them. Only once in a while, when there is dimensional instability, that I am able to step in the realms without causing any problems." Tatsuya widened his eyes and said, "I didn't think that a being as powerful as you will care about other mortals." The dragon snorted and said, "Who cares about them? They can all die, and I will not even bat an eye." I only refrain from harming them because they are the only source of my entertainment. Tatsuya looked at the dragon with amazement and asked, how? The dragon then said, you see, the dreams that these mortals have are very fun to watch and interfere to. You will cry out because of laughing so much on my how weird the dreams can get. Not to mention the so-called wet dreams they have, they are even weirder than their normal dreams. Tatsuya looked at the dragon with a deadpan expression and then said, I am changing your title. From now on you will be the dragon of wet dreams, pervert. Great Red, who heard the new title that Tatsuya just gave her, said, HY, don't even dare call me that. It is all your mortals' fault for imagining those kinds of things. I only watch them. Tatsuya, who still had a neutral expression, said, and that's why you are a pervert to peep on others. The dragon, who heard Tatsuya, became more annoyed and said, you are in no position to call me a pervert when you yourself act like one with cat girls and little girls. Tatsuya shook his head and said, I'm not a pervert, the only things I like are fluffy and cute. The dragon remained silent for a while and then said, that's the same damn thing, you bastard. Tatsuya, who was not floating in front of the dragon, was blown away by the wind coming out of its mouth, said, whoa, calm down there, and how the hell do you know that I like loli? I mean cute and fluffy things? You just said that you can't read my mind. The dragon looked at him with a deadpan look and said, of course I cannot read your mind, but it doesn't mean that I can't read the minds of others, and since you do it in front of everyone I have seen everything. Tatsuya, who heard that, thought, there is really no such thing as privacy in this world. Tatsuya then said, well, whatever, it was nice talking to you, but I must get going now. At this the dragon got surprised and said, what's the hurry? Stay a bit longer, it's been so long since I get to talk to someone who is not pissing himself in my presence or is challenging me to a fight or even worse, trying to take me under control. Tatsuya waved his hand and said, I would love to keep you company, but it is getting quite late already. The others must be worried about me. At this the dragon got depressed and then slumped his head and said, I understand, just try to come here from time to time. It can get really boring here, since the only thing that I can do is watch over things. In a sad tone, Tatsuya looked at the dragon for a while and then asked, do you want to try living in the human world? The dragon looked at Tatsuya with an annoyed expression on its face and said, listen here, I just said that I cannot step in Nas dash. Tatsuya cut her speech and said, that's not what I asked for. What I asked is whether you want to live or not. The dragon got more annoyed and said in an agitated tone, of course I want to live there. I want to try the different foods and entertainment there. I want to try all those things that do in those dreams of theirs on my own. I mean, just imagine yourself watching others copulate, but you are not even able to help yourself. That's how I feel here. Tatsuya looked at the dragon with widened eyes and said, you got over dramatic there, and what's with that torture of an example? That's just plain cruel. Anyways, if you want to live in that world, I can let you do that. The dragon blinked in surprise but soon narrowed them and said, you are not planning on sealing me in some sort of sacred gear or something, right? Tatsuya shook his head and said, nah, that way you will be sealed for an even longer time. I mean, who would be able to control your power, and I don't have any need of a sacred gear, even if it's your power. So do you want to go? The dragon looked at Tatsuya for a while, judging whether what Tatsuya is saying is true or not. Finally sighing, the dragon said, fine, but don't try anything that can lead to serious circumstances. Even if I cannot perceive your power, there is no way that even you can take me down easily. Tatsuya nodded and said, okay, now turn into human. The dragon looked at him and said, why? Tatsuya looked at the dragon as if it was an idiot and said, what, you want me to put a leash on you and say that you are my new pet dog? Of course, how will you live in that world if not in a human form? The dragon nodded and then suddenly its body started glowing. Chapter 138, Appearance Poll. Chapter 139, To the Human World. After the dragon's body started glowing brighter and brighter, Tatsuya took out sunglasses from his storage and put them on and looked at the dragon's direction. Great Red's body started getting smaller and smaller to the point that it was just about Tatsuya's height. The body then started changing its form from a four-legged dragon to a more humanoid form. The light then started to get dimmer and soon it died down and revealed Great Red's human form. Tatsuya then took off his sunglasses to look more clearly at the human form and was completely surprised by what he saw. In front of him was a girl who looked close to his age, having scarlet hair which reaches down to her shoulder blades. The girl had golden eyes with vertically slitted pupils with pronounced sharp teeth. This, coupled with her being completely naked in front of him, which revealed her ample chest, which in no way can be considered average, made Tatsuya completely stunned. The dragon who had checked her body looked at Tatsuya and found him to be motionless. The girl smirked and said, is the Lilicon stunned by my beautiful body? And emphasized her body and more by making poses. Tatsuya, who snapped out of trance because of this, nodded his head and said, yes, you look truly beautiful. In that form I was completely stunned by your appearance. But I think that you should wear some clothes first. This was now the dragon god's turn to become stunned by Tatsuya's honest answer, but still she came out of her trance and nodded her head. She then snapped her fingers and suddenly her naked body got covered by a black one-piece dress, which somehow made her look even more sexy in Tatsuya's view. The dragon looked at Tatsuya and asked, is this fine? Tatsuya nodded his head and said, yup, you look absolutely gorgeous in it. Tatsuya then became a bit curious and asked, hey, were you genderless as well, like Ophis, or were you a female from the start? Red looked at Tatsuya and said, nope, I was genderless from the start. I can take any gender I want. Tatsuya then asked, then why did you take a female form? Red shrugged her shoulder and said, no reason. Since Ophis took a female form, I took one as well. Besides, you were a male here, so I thought that being a female would suit me better. She then paused for a while and then asked, or would you have preferred if I would have been a loli? Tatsuya shook his head and said, no, you look beautiful as you are now. But why does me being a male matters for you to be a female? Red looked at him as if he was an idiot and said, Of course I would be a female. I said so earlier, didn't I, that I want to try everything that I watch in dreams, so I want to try sex as well. And who can be my partner other than you? Tatsuya blinked his eyes in surprise and then said, wait. You chose female just so you can have sex with me? If you want to do that, you can do it with someone else. There are a lot of males out there. Or you can have either turned a male as well. Red still have him a look like he was an idiot and said, I just told you that my power and not completely under control. Do you think that if I were a male and were to do it with some girl, can they even survive one thrust from me if I were to lose control? Tatsuya then imagined a couple having sex when suddenly the girl blasted into pieces because of the man's thrust. This made Tatsuya shudder and he said, that would totally be a no-go. But still, why me? Red shrugged her shoulders and said, what are you getting surprised for? At the end of the day, I am still a dragon. Of course, I will only choose someone who is strong and capable, and who would be more worthy for all-powered me besides you, whose limit even the great me cannot tell. Also, there is the fact that you are the only male that I know of currently, and I hardly believe that there will be someone stronger than you. Tatsuya looked at the girl for a while and then sighed while scratching the back of his head and said, look here, I am not doing this so as to have sex with you. I am just doing this on a whim. You don't have to do anything in return. Also, I am not someone who is going to do it with someone I don't love. The dragon just shrugged her shoulder and said, you mean that you are not in love with me yet? Relax. We can take things slowly. I have a lot of time, so don't worry. I won't force you. After all, if the things go just as you said, then I will be able to live freely in a mortal realm, and that is something that is more than I can even ask for. There is no way that I will do something to my benefactor. Tatsuya smiled at her and said, well, let's just end it at that. So how strong are you now compared to your dragon form? The girls closed her eyes and started to sense her powers, and after she was done she opened them and said, well, I only have a third of my power in this form, but don't worry, it should be enough to face any problems in that realm. I am still twice as strong than those two heavenly lizards combined. Tatsuya chuckled at her answer and then said, well, let's get your body able to step in the mortal world. Tatsuya then came closer to Great Red and started moving his hands towards her and placed it on top of her head. The girl looked at Tatsuya with confusion when suddenly she felt something enter her body. Tatsuya started to channel his energy to her and said, I am channeling some of my power towards you, so don't be impatient. But she completely ignored what he said, and the only voice that came out of her mouth was, so good. Tatsuya looked at the girl in front of her, and the expression which she was making made him hard immediately, but he still controlled his urge and worked on what he was doing while trying with all his might to give in to his instincts. When he was done, both the girl and the boy were breathing heavily, the girl because of pleasure and the boy because of ignoring his pleasure. Tatsuya looked at her and asked, what was that? And why the hell was I being attracted to you? The girl looked at Tatsuya with a mischievous smile on her face and said, oh, nothing. Don't forget I am a dragon and a god at that. So my aura will attract the opposite sex just like other dragons. Though I think that mine is a bit stronger. Tatsuya simply nodded his head and thought, I will have to control both myself and her aura, otherwise she can even be the first person to get pregnant out of the others, and I have to do something about that aura of hers. I don't want others constantly coming to court her. He thought for a while and then formed a bracelet in his hand and said, wear this, it will prevent your aura from leaking to some extent while also stabilizing your uncontrolled power a bit as well. The girl nodded and then put on the bracelet in her hand and looked at it for a while and then smiled and said, thanks. She then looked at Tatsuya for a while and then said, hey, why don't you give me a name to call me by? I don't think Great Red will be something that you would want to call me in public. Tatsuya nodded as his, and he thought the same as well, and then started thinking for a name for her, and after thinking for a while he said, how about Ruya? It means a lady who is like a dream. The dragon now named Ruya muttered her name for a while and then smiled at Tatsuya, making him completely mesmerized, and said, thank you, I will cherish this name for all my life. Tatsuya soon snapped out, and the only thing that came to his mind was, I can't confirm whether her aura has suppressed or not, but I think that both of us will have a long journey ahead of us. Tatsuya then sighed and said, so shall we get going? At this, Ruya's eyes started shining and she said, yeah, let's go immediately, I want to try out a lot of things out there. Tatsuya just chuckled and was about to make a portal but soon stopped and said, wait, won't it be a problem if the Great Red suddenly disappeared from the dimensional gap? Ruya thought for a while and then used her magic. Suddenly a huge red dragon appeared in front of them. Tatsuya looked at the dragon for a while and asked, is that a clone? Ruya shook her head and said, no, it is the outer layer of my scales. They are still mostly indestructible and I also filled them with magic, so no one will suspect it and the gap will move the body itself. Tatsuya nodded his head understanding, and then looked back at her and asked, but will you be fine without your outer scales? Ruya patted her chest with her fist, making her breast jiggle, and then said, don't worry, there are a lot of layers of scales under that and my scales will grow back in time, so there is no problem. Tatsuya nodded and then formed a portal to Kuo town and then moved his hand towards Ruya and said, so shall we get going? Ruya immediately took Tatsuya's hand and said, hell yeah, I'm going to the mortal world now. Tatsuya smiled and then moved to the portal along with her, and both of them then disappeared from the dimensional gap, leaving behind the hollow body of Great Red. Chapter 140. Checking for injuries. After Tatsuya and Ruya left the dimensional gap, both of them appeared at the spot from where Tatsuya was transported. Both of them landed on the ground and Tatsuya looked up at the sky and said, oh boy, it's very late. The others must be severely pissed by now. He then turned his sight towards the dragon god who was looking around her as if to confirm something. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then asked, hey, what happened to you? Ruya looked at Tatsuya with some tears in her eyes and said, I can finally step in the mortal realm without causing any problems, and hugged Tatsuya tightly. Tatsuya was a bit surprised by her actions, stood silently for a while but soon hugged her back. After hugging each other for a while, Ruya separated herself from Tatsuya and asked, But how did you manage to let me out of the gap? No one was able to do it before without causing any problems, so how? Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, it is actually very simple. You told me that the only time that you were able to come to the mortal realm was the time when there was some dimensional instability, right? Ruya nodded her head while looking intently at Tatsuya waiting for the explanation. Tatsuya just grinned and said, so I did just that. I made a very thin layer around your body in which very small-scale dimensional cracks are occurring and restoring themselves, constantly making the region around you completely disoriented. But you don't have to worry about anything as the cracks are very small and the layer is very thin. You will suffer from no damage at all. Though I connected the layer directly to your energy pool to let it draw energy directly from your body, but it only takes a bit that you won't have a problem during normal day-to-day work. Ruya looked at Tatsuya with an expression which said, what the hell are you saying? To which Tatsuya replied with an expression which said, isn't that a normal thing to do? Ruya's lips twitched and she said, there is no way that's normal. Connecting spells with someone else's mana pool is very difficult, and it causes a major backlash to the caster itself and a layer of continuous small dimensional cracks. How the hell is that even possible to do? Tatsuya simply tilted his head and said, huh. It's pretty simple, just spread the space creation and space distortion magic particles unevenly on the layer and let them do their own work. They will continue to their work and will simply travel to different places doing the same thing again. Ruya was looking at Tatsuya with widened eyes and said, and how is it possible to form a very thin layer to not even be noticed by the person who is covered in the layer, not break by uneven spreading of the magic particles, and before that what the hell are space creation and destruction particles? Aren't both the same thing? Tatsuya was about to explain it to her, but she raised her hand motioning him to stop. She then gave a tired sigh and then said, forget it. I'm not interested in your over-the-top magic simple explanation. This time Tatsuya was the one whose brows were twitching, but he composed himself and then said, anyways, let's get going back to my home. The others must be worried. Tatsuya was about to teleport but soon stopped and said, well, let's go, and started walking towards his home. Ruya looked at him with a confused expression and then asked, isn't teleporting faster than walking? Tatsuya turned around and said, yeah, it is, but you won't be able to see around the town if we do that, right? And smiled. Ruya was stunned by his answer and then smiled, and then as if the soul of a child in her eyes started sparkling, and she immediately latched onto Tatsuya and said, then what are we waiting for? Let's get going. Tatsuya smiled and then said, yes, let's go, and started walking, but suddenly he felt a soft sensation on his hand and turned his head with curious expression on his face, only to find his hand in between Ruya's breasts. Tatsuya stood there for a while looking at Ruya for an explanation, but she only looked back at him with an expression which said, what are we waiting for? Tatsuya sighed and then said, why are you holding my arm like that? Ruya looked back at him without any change in her expression and said, and was there a problem with it? Tatsuya nodded his head and said, it is too intimate for people who are not a couple. Ruya waved her hand and said, don't sweat on the small details and let's get going. Tatsuya just sighed and easily freed his hand and said, yes, let's go, and started walking. Behind him Ruya also started walking and muttered, so he noticed, it is not going to be easy to be intimate with him. Well, whatever, I came here to enjoy anyway. Might as well enjoy this as well. It is not going to get boring anytime soon. Tatsuya, who was walking ahead of Ruya, didn't heard what she said as he was thinking of other things, and he was also quite tired because of the hectic day. Both of them soon reached in front of Tatsuya's house, and before entering Tatsuya looked at Ruya and said, whatever happens, don't feel offended or attack the others. Ruya looked at Tatsuya with a questioning look, but soon she realized what he was talking about and nodded his head. Tatsuya then put the key and opened the door, and just as he did that he was immediately tackled by a blur which he caught without falling down. He then lifted the person up, which revealed to be Miyuki, looking at Tatsuya with a worried expression. Miyuki, who was still in Tatsuya's hand, started checking him for any injuries and asked, Oni-sama, are you alright? Why are you so late? Did someone attack you? Do you want me to slice his body into tiny pieces? Tatsuya looked at Miyuki with a wry smile on his face and said, calm down, Miyuki, I am fine, I am not injured at all, and I was also not attacked. Miyuki nodded her head, still feeling worried about Tatsuya but still sighed in relief. Seeing that Miyuki had calmed down a bit, Tatsuya put her down and then saw others standing behind her, but all of them were in defensive positions. Suddenly Miyuki realized something as well and jumped back and got in a defensive stance as well. Tatsuya then sighed on seeing their actions, and suddenly a red-headed woman came in front and stood beside Tatsuya. The girl had an amused grin on her face and she said, oh, I have seen how all of them trained with my own eyes, but to think that they were able to sense my power, I am quite impressed with it. Though I doubt that they are able to sense my true power, but well, it is quite good for them. As expected of MY Tatsuya. Your team is very strong. Just as Ruya said, MY Tatsuya, all of them widened their eyes and looked at Tatsuya, who looked at they with a neutral expression and shook his head in denial. Getting the answer from Tatsuya, Miyuki came forward and said, hey red-head bitch, were you the one who tried to seduce Oni-sama, making him come home late in the process? Tatsuya looked at Miyuki and thought, I know that she likes me, but to insult the strongest being in the world, well, second strongest now, like this on the face, if anyone else were to see it while knowing Ruya's identity, they would certainly faint from fear. Tatsuya was about to intervene when suddenly a magic circle appeared in the room and 3 figures appeared out of it. Suddenly one of the figures immediately jumped at Tatsuya and said, Tatsuya, I missed you. Tatsuya caught the black-haired Nekishu easily and hugged her and gave her a peck on the lips and said, Kuroka, I missed you as well. How have you been? Kuroka returned the kiss as well and smiled at Tatsuya and said, I have been good, just missed you a lot, Naya. And kissed him again. Tatsuya returned the kiss and then asked, so why the sudden visit? Kuroka, who was still smiling, said, well, Office Naya said something that it is here, Naya. With a confused expression on her face. Tatsuya and Kuroka then turned their heads and saw Office standing in front of Ruya looking directly in her eyes while Ruya was doing the same. Everyone else other than Tatsuya was confused about what they were doing, and then the third person that came just now moved towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at the person who came closer to him and smiled. "Lefei, good to see you again," and patted her head. The blonde-haired witch smiled on receiving the head pat and then said, "I am happy to meet you again, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya just smiled at her and continued to pay her head, not noticing the tense atmosphere that was building around the two girls who continued to stare at each other. Miyuki then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Oni-sama, who actually is that redhead?" At her question, all the others turned their head and looked at Tatsuya intently waiting for answers. Tatsuya gave a tired sigh and then said, "The person standing in front of Office is the Great Red, the Dragon of Wet Dreams." Everyone was completely speechless by the suddenly revelation and all looked at the redhead with fear evident in their eyes. While this was happening, the said redhead was fuming with anger and soon she snapped and punched Tatsuya, who simply evaded it. The girl looked at Tatsuya with anger and said, "Don't you dare call me that, you Lilicon." Tatsuya just snorted and said, "I already told you that I am not a Lilicon." Ruya then pointed her finger at Tatsuya and said, "Then what the hell are you doing?" Tatsuya then turned his gaze downwards while all the others looked at him and found him to be patting both Office and Lefei, who had a blissful expression on her face, while Office was still expressionless but was still feeling happy on the inside. Tatsuya then slowly lifted his head and looked at Ruya and said, "Just seeing that whether they are safe from your attack or not. I am totally not patting them because they are too cute," with a neutral expression on his face. All of them who heard his answer twitched their lips and thought at the same time, "Lilicon." Tatsuya, who heard what all of them thought through his telepathy, internally snorted and thought, "I regret nothing." Chapter 141. Talk between the Dragon Gods. After everyone got a bit calm because of the revelation, all of them were sitting around a table while some girls were cooking the dinner. Office was sitting on Tatsuya's lap while facing Ruya sitting on front of her, continuously staring at each other. The other girls who were not currently cooking were a bit tensed as they thought that the two dragon gods could suddenly lash out each other and were hoping for it not happen. After all, who would like to get caught up between the fight of the dragon gods? Tatsuya, who noticed the tense atmosphere around him, caressed Office's hair to get her attention. Office then looked up to look at Tatsuya's face. Tatsuya looked back at her and asked, "You should not stare at her like that. The others are getting tensed because of the tension between you two." Office then turned her head and looked at others only to see helpless smiles on their faces. Not understanding what the smiles meant, she again looked up and tilted her head and said, "But they are smiling." Tatsuya, who saw her doing that, got very excited but still controlled himself and with a smile on his face said, "Yes, they are smiling, but they are not smiling because they are happy. They are smiling because..." Well, how shall I explain this? Yes, you can say this as they are smiling because they don't want to show that they are scared. You can see that their smiles are a bit different, right? Office then looked at the others once again and then noticed their smiles carefully for a while and then nodded her head. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "They scared." Tatsuya just chuckled at her question and nodded his head. Office nodded as well and then said, "Don't worry, not in the mood to fight." These were the words that she thought were the best to let them feel a bit safe. All of them looked at Office and then started chuckling. Ruya, who was looking at the scene taking place in front of her, smiled and said, "You have changed, Office." All of them then fell silent and then once again started looking intently at the dragon gods. Office looked at Ruya and said, "How are you here, Bakaret?" Ruya looked back at Office and said, "First of all, my name is Ruya," and then paused for a while to let her fellow dragon god digest the information. Office tilted her head and said, "You are not Bakaret?" Ruya's head suddenly crashed with the table and she said, "No, I am the Great Red, but from now on my name is Ruya." Office, who now understood what she meant, nodded her head and said, "Why are you here, Bakaya?" making Ruya fell down dramatically once again. Ruya then sat straight and said, "Forget it. I am here because I want to see the mortal world by myself and experience a lot of things here." Office remained silent for a while and then said, "But you were not able to leave my home?" Ruya nodded her head and said, "Yup, I was not able to leave the gap, but because of My Tatsuya I was able to come here." When she said, My Tatsuya, both Office's and Kuroka's ears twitched. Kuroka wanted to glare at the redhead, but knowing her identity she refrained from doing that. On the other hand, Office felt a bit uncomfortable and said, "You cannot take Tatsuya," and hugged him. At this, everyone got surprised with the action that Office did, but still two people had different reactions than the others. Ruya, who saw what Office did, had a mischievous grin on her face while Tatsuya just smiled at what Office did. Tatsuya hugged her back and said, "Don't worry, Office-chan, she can't take me." Office looked at Tatsuya and after seeing his smiling face for a while nodded and stopped hugging him. Tatsuya just patted her head and then looked at Ruya with a cold glare and said, "And you stop spouting things that others will misunderstand. We are not in a relationship yet, so don't address me as My Tatsuya. Understood?" Ruya, who saw Tatsuya's glare, was not scared by it, but still nodded her head and said, "Fine, fine. Anyway, Office." Office looked at Ruya when she heard her call and said, "What?" while subconsciously there was a bit anger in her voice. Ruya smiled and said, "You can live in the dimensional gap if you want. I will not be there for quite a long time, so I won't be disturbing you." Office looked at her for a while and then asked, "So where will you live from now on?" Ruya looked at her with a neutral expression on her face and said, "Where? Isn't it obvious that I will live here from now on?" At this, everyone else's except for Tatsuya's eyes widened in surprise. All of them then looked at Tatsuya waiting for answer. Tatsuya looked at others and said, "She will be living with us. After all, we cannot let the other factions know that the strongest being in the world has disappeared from the gap. So this is the only option for us." All of them thought for a while and then nodded their heads except for Office, who was silently looking at Ruya. Ruya, who noticed her gaze, smirked and asked, "What? Jealous of me?" Office remained silent for a while and then said, I will stay here as well. All of them got shocked by her answer, and then Lefei asked, why do you want to live here, Office-sama? Office looked at Lefei, and then pointed her finger at Ruya and said, SH will take Tatsuya. Just like how she took my silence, making the others shocked once again. Soon Ruya broke out laughing, making the others look at her. After she stopped laughing, she looked at Office and said, don't worry, Office, I am not going to take him for myself. Rather than that, I will be sharing him with others. Office looked at her for a while and then said, sharing for what? After listening her question, Ruya was about to explain her what she meant, but before she was able to, Tatsuya intervened and said, hey guys, I think the dinner is ready. He then looked at Ruya and gave a menacing glare and sent a telepathic message to her which said, don't you dare corrupt her innocence. Seeing this glare, all of them except for Office, who was in his lap, got scared and put a hand on their mouths. Office, who saw their reactions, got confused and turned her head towards Tatsuya, who made a 180 degrees change in her expression and smiled at Office. Office looked at him for a while and then asked, why are they doing that? Tatsuya continued to smile and said, I don't know. Maybe they feel a bit sick, right? And turned his head towards others with a smile on his face. But the people other than Office who saw his smile shivered in fear and hurriedly nodded their heads. Tatsuya then looked back at Office and said, see, they are a bit sick. That's all. Come on, let's go and have something to eat. I will even get you a chocolate after the meal. Office, who heard the item that she will get, immediately nodded her head. Tatsuya chuckled at her actions and then carried her to the dining room. Chapter 142. Legal. After Tatsuya was able to protect Office's innocence, all of them were sitting together while having dinner. But all of the girls were staring at Office, who was sitting in Tatsuya's lap and was being fed by him. Tatsuya looked at her with a helpless expression and asked, Office-chan, don't you think it would be better if you eat by your own? I mean, that way you would be able to eat easily. Seriously, being stared continuously by the others while eating is not a pleasant experience, especially when they all look at me as if I am some sort of pervert. Oh, Office-chan is looking so cute. Office looked back at Tatsuya and said, more comfortable here and easy to eat. She then opened her mouth for Tatsuya to feed her. Tatsuya just gave a tired sigh and then put some food in her mouth. He then picked something up for himself and then ate it, but the others were still looking at him intently. Noticing that they were not going to stop looking anytime soon, Tatsuya decided to enjoy this moment to the fullest. He was already being looked by piercing gazes, and any more could not hurt him further. Besides, what he was thinking to do made will be much more blissfully than their gazes. Tatsuya poked Office's cheek, making her turn her head and look at Tatsuya. Tatsuya then bit a bit and whispered something in her ear. After Office heard what Tatsuya was saying, she nodded her head and took a spoon in her hand. All the other girls who saw that thought that Tatsuya somehow managed to convince her to eat by herself, but what she did next left all of them speechless. Office took some soup in her spoon and moved it towards Tatsuya's mouth and said, and Tatsuya, who saw her asking to feed him, just smiled and opened his mouth and ate the food with a satisfied smile on his face. The others started giving more hateful gaze to the two of them in the hope of making them stop, but the two of them completely ignored them and silently are while feeding each other, with Tatsuya having a bright smile on his face and Office feeling happy inside. Seeing that nothing was working on the two of them, one of the girls resolved herself and said, open wide, Tatsuya. And Tatsuya looked at Kuroka, who was holding on her spoon and was asking him to eat with a smile on her face. Seeing no problem with it, Tatsuya are from Kuroka's spoon, making her happy. Seeing that all the girls on the table now looked at Kuroka with a hateful gaze, except Lefei, to which Kuroka replied with a prideful smile on her face and puffing out her chest. All of them continued to grit their teeth, but the next thing made them all snap. Tatsuya took a move to spoon towards Kuroka's direction and said, Kuroka, and Kuroka looked at Tatsuya with a look of surprise in her eyes, which immediately turned into a happy smile, and she immediately put the spoon in her mouth. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, thanks, Tatsuya, that was very delicious. Seeing that all the others were about to feed him as well, but Office interrupted them and asked, why did you feed him? And looked at Kuroka with an innocent expression on her face. Kuroka just smiled and said, to show that I like him, Office. It is a sign of affection. Office was still confused, continued to look at her, and seeing that Kuroka asked, then why did you feed him? Office still looked at her with a neutral expression on her face, said, to return the favor for sitting in his lap. All of them then looked at Tatsuya with a questioning look on their faces, while Tatsuya only averted his gaze. All of them then looked at Office, and then Miyuki said, then do you like sitting on his lap? Office only nodded her head in confirmation. Miyuki smiled and said, then you can AAE that you fed him to show that you like being near him. Office, who heard what Miyuki said, remained silent and thought for a while. She then took her spoon and moved it towards Kuroka's direction and said, on. Kuroka looked at her with a questioning gaze, but soon their doubt was cleared by Tatsuya, who said, she is trying to say that she likes being near you, and patted Office's head. Kuroka and the others smiled, and then Kuroka ate from Office. After that, Office took turn to feed each of the girls and they did the same as well. All this happened while Ruya was completely left out by the others, and none of them was even looking at her, making her twitch her lips and look at the scene in front of her with an annoyed glare. Tatsuya, who was fed by all the girls, noticed her glare and sighed. He then took his spoon and moved it towards her and said, you are going to be the part of the group from now on, so I guess there is no harm in doing something like this. Ruya looked at the spoon in front of her for a while and then simply put it in her mouth without saying anything. She then turned her head and said, thanks, I guess. All of them then looked at her, and all of them, except Office, had an amused smile on their faces. All of them started teasing her, making her blush from embarrassment, which led to bickering among the girls. Tatsuya and Office, who were now sitting silently, were looking at the girls bickering among themselves. Tatsuya had a smile on his face and he thought, Who could guess that there are two of the world's strongest beings and two terrorists in this group of lively girls? It seems like now they are not hesitant of Ruya. Well, that's a plus on its own. Suddenly he felt a tug on his shirt, and he looked down to see Office looking at her. Tatsuya just smiled and said, "What happened, Office-chan?" Office asked, "Why are you smiling while looking at them?" Tatsuya just patted her head and said, "Well, I am just happy seeing my loved ones are enjoying and are happy. Don't you think so as well?" Office thought for a while and nodded her head and said, "Yes, I am enjoying this as well." She then fell silent for a while and then asked, "Tatsuya, do you like me as well?" Tatsuya, who heard her question, fell silent for a while and then hugged her and said, "Is that even a question to ask? I absolutely love you a lot." Office, who heard the answer, felt happy from inside and unconsciously her lips curled up in a smile, though it was not noticed by others except Tatsuya as she was in his embrace. Tatsuya then noticed that the others were silent and looked at them and found them to be looking at him as well. Tatsuya looked at them with a questioning gaze and seeing that all of them sighed. Himari then said, "You do know that you can get arrested for how you are behaving, right?" Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then smirked, making all of them confused. Seeing the confused look on their faces, Tatsuya chuckled and said, "No one can do that. Office is completely legal." All of them then fell silent and didn't know how to retort to what Tatsuya said. Knowing what they were thinking, Tatsuya said, "Don't think much about it. I know I am absolutely right here." Hearing what he said, all of their brows then twitched. Suddenly Office again tugged his shirt and said, "Sweets?" Tatsuya, who understood what she meant, looked at Asia and said, "Asia, can you bring some desserts for everyone?" And as if nothing happened earlier, Asia gave a beautiful smile and said, "Of course," and then went to the kitchen while humming. Seeing her leave, some of the girls followed her to help her in the kitchen. Ruya then looked at Office and said, "Office, you should keep your distance from this guy. He is very bad." Office tilted her head in confusion and said, "But I like being near Tatsuya. He is good. He even helped me in achieving my silence by throwing out Bakared from my home." Tatsuya, who heard that, smiled and said, "Yeah, tell her, Office." Seeing both of them, Ruya twitched her lips and said, "At least, you can take a mature form so that people don't look at the both of you weirdly." At this, Office became confused and asked, "You mean big like the others?" Ruya thought for a while and then said, "Well, in a way, yeah, I mean at least look a little older." Office then looked at Tatsuya with any change in her expression. Seeing her looking intently at him, he patted her head and said, "I don't mind however you look like. I like Office, it doesn't matter whether you are young or old." Office, who heard that, nodded and was about to change her appearance, but before she was able to, the others came back with sweets and placed them on the table. This time Office didn't ask Tatsuya to feed her and immediately took a spoon and started eating her cake. Seeing her like that, the others smiled and then started eating their cake as well while talking to each other. While talking, Tatsuya accidentally took a piece from Office's cake, which Office thought that he was about to feed her, and opened her mouth. But the spoon just passed by her, making her turn her head and saw Tatsuya put it in his mouth. Seeing him put the cake in his mouth, Office moved towards him and placed her lips on his, making him as well as the others stop because of the shock. Office then snatched the cake from his mouth and said, "My cake," and again started eating while leaving the others completely shocked, though Tatsuya was feeling rather happy by the event. Chapter 143. You don't want to? After Office was able to snatch her cake from Tatsuya while leaving the others shocked, all of them decided to leave the matter and went asleep. Though this time Tatsuya was enveloped by all his girls with the addition of Kuroka and Office, who was protecting him from Ruya. But the said attacker was left to sleep alone in another room, making her slightly pissed, and she decided to take revenge on them later. The next day when they woke up, Tatsuya felt a lot of weight on his body, and even though he was reluctant, he still opened his eyes. But after opening them, he was completely surprised to see that there was complete darkness. He then tried to move his limbs, only to find difficulty in doing so. Suddenly he realized what happened and gave a tired sigh. He then used his psychic powers to slowly move the bodies lying on him away, and then slipped out of the girls' grasps. He then slowly placed the girls back on bed and smiled at them, but then he noticed that Office was not there. He then left the room and got refreshed and got ready for his morning training and went downstairs, and on his way he saw both Office and Ruya talking to each other. Seeing that they were talking a bit seriously, he decided to leave them alone and left the house for his training. After Tatsuya was done taking a shower after his training to wash off the sweat, he came out and saw some of the girls preparing the breakfast while the others were simply fooling around. Seeing that all of them were doing something, he went to check his restaurant to do some of the paperwork that have been piling up because of the recent events. He went through the work and sighed, seeing how the number of invitations for various events that were present there. These were some of the things that he didn't like about his business. After he was done with quite a lot of them, he went back and sat down with the others to have his breakfast. While eating, he felt a tug on his shirt, and knowing who was doing that, he turned his head with a smile on his face and asked, "What happened, Office?" Office kept on looking at his face for a while with her usual expressionless face. Tatsuya also stared at her for a while with a confused expression on his face, and was about to use his telekinesis to know what she was thinking. But before he was able to, Office tilted her head and asked, "Do you want to copulate with me?" Clank clank asterisk. Suddenly the sound of a lot of spoons falling from the hands of others was heard. All of them stared at Office with a "what the hell did you just said" expression on their faces, while Lefei had a slight blush on her cheeks because of embarrassment. Tatsuya stared at her for a while with a completely shocked expression on his face, and his thoughts were completely in a mess. What the hell just happened? No, I do know what happened, and that's not the problem. The problem here is, what the hell should I do? The offer is very tempting, but this will make me look like a scum in the eyes of others. Though I don't give a shit about what others think, and there is also the fact that I like her, and she is legal as well, so no problems regarding that. He was then going to open his mouth to say something, but just as he did, he sensed the others glaring at him. He didn't even have to turn his head, and he could feel that the others were glaring at him. He then closed his mouth once again and thought, Let's just leave all the temptations to the side for now and TK about it logically. She was completely innocent till yesterday, and there is no way that she would have said something like this. It means that someone must have given her information about these things. But the question is who? Suddenly a realization hit him, and he immediately turned his head and looked at Ruya, who had a mischievous grin on her face. Tatsuya gave her a glare, to which she just snorted and continued to smirk. Tatsuya wanted to punch her and wipe that grin of her face, but he calmed down and controlled himself. He then began thinking, but suddenly Office said, "You don't want to," with a bit of sadness in her voice, though her face was still expressionless. Tatsuya, who got hit by the sudden attack, was not able to think further and said, "There is no way that I don't want to, yo." His sudden outburst made all the people present in the room surprised, but once they came back to realization, the other girls only sighed, with Luffei having a deep blush on her face and Office had a small smile on her face. Suddenly the doorbell rang and all of them became normal once again. Tatsuya, who was feeling very awkward, decided to go and check who was on the door and quickly left. Once Tatsuya opened the door, he saw Kaneko standing there with her usual cold expression on her face, which turned into a small smile when she saw Tatsuya. Tatsuya smiled as well and said, "Good morning, Kaneko-chan. What brought you here so early?" The morning. Kaneko then took out a notebook out of nowhere and said, "Miyuki's notebook got mixed up in my stuff, and since we had assignment to complete, I thought that she might be troubled." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Thank you for coming all the way here to just return that. Why don't you join us for the breakfast if you don't mind?" Kaneko, who heard the question, was about to deny, but suddenly her stomach growled, earning a small chuckle from Tatsuya while she just blushed in embarrassment. Kaneko looked at Tatsuya with a blush on her face and said, "Then I guess I will take you up on the offer." Tatsuya just nodded and let her in and closed the door while Kaneko went towards the room where the others were present. Tatsuya suddenly thought that he was forgetting something, but soon remembered what when he saw the horrified expression on Kaneko's face. Crap, Kuroko was here as well, was all he thought, and immediately rushed towards the others. Once he reached there, he saw both Kaneko and Kuroko having a shocked expression on their faces, and seeing that the room was completely quiet, he sighed and said, "Why don't all of you sit down first, and then we can talk?" All of them looked at him for a while and finally accepting his suggestion. Kaneko was no exception of that, even though she didn't had a good impression of Kuroko, but she decided to trust Tatsuya and her friends and took a seat. All of them then sat around the table, and the room was completely quiet, but still the one who had the most complex feelings in the room was Kaneko. On one hand, she was facing her sister who left her all those years ago, and now she saw some black-haired loli sitting in Tatsuya's lap while looking at others. Who is she? How does she have the rights to sit in Senpai's lap? Office, who noticed her gaze at her, said, "My seat," which made most of the girls in the room twitch their lips. Chapter 144. I win. After Office made everyone clear about her seat, all of them got serious once again, and both the sisters were now ready to confront each other. Kaneko looked at Kuroko for a while and then said, "Wani-sama, what are you doing here?" Kuroko only showed a playful smile and said, "I am here to visit my mate Tatsuya." Kaneko's lips twitched when she heard that, and this was not left unnoticed by Kuroko. Kaneko sighed and said, "Can you be a bit more serious?" Kuroko acted to be hurt by her comment and said, "You think I am joking here, Naya? Well, you will have the proof in a few months when you will become the aunt of my kittens, Naya," and looked away. Hearing her answer, all the girls immediately looked at Tatsuya, who was not even bothered by what Kuroko said and was happily eating cake along with Office. Seeing that most of the girls sighed except for Kaneko, who gave a glare to Office, to which she replied with a victorious smile on her face. Kaneko was about to lash out at her, but soon turned her head when she felt her surroundings getting cold. She saw Miyuki releasing a lot of her magic power and had ice formed around her. Miyuki then looked at Kuroko and said, Kuroko-san, you should know that there are some matters that you should not joke about, right?" with a friendly smile on her face. And suddenly Kuroko jumped from her seat and everyone saw a huge ice spike where she was sitting. Seeing the ice spike, most of the girls there had cold sweat on their foreheads, and Kuroko immediately grabbed her, but which would have been penetrated if not for her jumping away. She looked at Miyuki with a smile with her lips twitching, and Sati said, "Miyuki-nya, you should not get angry at jokes, nya. We are friends, nya." Miyuki also kept her smile on her face and said, "Make a joke like that again and all of us will be mourning on our friend's death," with the same smile on her face. Hearing that, all of them looked at Miyuki and thought at the same time, "Fucking sadist." Miyuki then looked at Kaneko and said, "Oh, Kaneko-chan, sorry for interruption. Please continue," and then turned back to her normal mode. Kaneko looked at her friend for a while and then nodded and said, "Why did you left me, Wani-sama?" Before Kuroko can answer, Tatsuya interrupted them and said, "Oh, wait a minute." He then took out the journal that he got in the Nibiria's territory and placed it on the table. He then looked at Kaneko and said, "You sisters can sit together and go through the journal. I guess most of your questions will be answered from that." Both of them looked at the journal and then at Tatsuya, and at Tatsuya asked, "What is that?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "It is the diary of a lolicon." Hearing his answer, all of them looked at him with a dumbfounded expression, but it immediately changed into the ones of trying hard to hold their laugh when they heard a voice. "What will they know by reading your diary?" Tatsuya's lips twitched immediately and said, "I am not a lolicon. I only like cute, fluffy, and beautiful," and looked at Ruya, who was looking at him with a smirk on her face. Ruya then sighed and said, "Well, whatever." Tatsuya just ignored her and looked at Kaneko and said, "Go and read that, you will know why she did that back then." He then looked at Kuroko and said, "You can use it as a proof to clear your name as a stray as well," and smiled. Kuroko, who now understood what it was, immediately jumped on Tatsuya and then said in a joyful tone, "Tatsuya-nya, I love you, nya," and hugged him while pushing his face in between her breasts. Tatsuya, who was enjoying the feeling of the softness on his face, had a smile on his face, but soon decided to push her away as he was having problem to breathe. But before he was able to do that, Kuroko was immediately thrown away by Office, who was sandwiched in between the two. She then looked at Tatsuya and stared at him for a while before asking, "Do you like her boobs?" Hearing that all the attention was now on Tatsuya, who didn't know how to answer the dragon god's question. While this was going on, Kaneko was going through the journal given by Tatsuya and looked at Kuroka, who was rubbing her head after coming out of the crater formed by her when she was thrown by Ophis. She then looked at Kaneko, and when she found her looking at her as well, she just gave an apologetic smile and walked towards her. She was about to hug her, but Kaneko stopped her. Seeing what Kaneko did made Kuroka slightly disappointed, but she didn't show it on her face and said, "Sorry Shiro Naya. I hope that didn't made you feel uncomfortable Naya." All of them then looked back at the sisters curiously waiting for her response. Suddenly all of them were surprised when they saw Kaneko punching Kuroka's stomach with all her power, and even though Kuroka didn't move, her face still had a painful expression. Some of the girls were going to intervene between them, but Tatsuya raised his hand and made them stop. Kaneko then lifted her head and with tears in her eyes asked, "Why didn't you tell me about this before? Why didn't you take me with you? Do you know how sad I was for all those years?" Kuroka just looked at Kaneko with a pained expression on her face and immediately hugged her. Kaneko, who felt Kuroka hugging her, tried to free her out of her grasp but was unable to do so. She then heard Kuroka crying and then stopped. Kuroka, who now didn't feel any resistance from her sister, hugged her tighter and said, "I'm sorry Chiron. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Kuroka kept on apologizing without any care, and hearing her, Kaneko started to cry harder. Seeing the two of them, the others started to feel sad for them as well. Tatsuya, who saw how the situation was in the room, sighed and said, "Let's leave the two alone for a while. They will be able to sort out their feelings easier," and then stood up along with Ophis and left the room, and the others followed him soon. All of them were waiting silently for the sister to come out of the room and were looking at the door intently. Soon they saw the door opening and both the sisters coming out, with this time Kaneko having her cat ears on her head. Seeing the two along with Kaneko's ears out, Tatsuya smiled and said, "So everything got cleared between you two, huh?" Both Kuroka and Kaneko smiled at that. Kuroka said, "Thank you very much Tatsuya. I don't know how can I ever repay you Naya." Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulder and said, "Just let me enjoy you tails and ears in return." Hearing that, Kuroka made a mischievous smile and said, "Of course I don't mind Naya, but you do know that you have to take responsibility for that, right Naya?" Tatsuya, who heard that, just gave a smile in return and said something to her telepathically, making her blush and have a happy expression on her face. Kaneko then came closer to Tatsuya and said, "Senpai, did you know about me and my sister from the beginning?" Tatsuya looked at Kaneko with a neutral expression and said, "Yeah." Seeing no change in his expression, Kaneko's ears twitched, which made Tatsuya's brow twitch as well because of how cute Kaneko looked at that time. Kaneko then did a pout, adding more damage, and said, "Then you should have told me so. I hate you senpai," and looked away. Tatsuya just gave a wry smile and said, "I cannot do that. It should have been Kuroka herself to tell you about all this." Kaneko then looked at Tatsuya and stared at him for a while and then said, "I am very grateful for this senpai." Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, "You don't need to mind that. I am your senpai after all. It is my duty to help my cute kohai." Kaneko looked at him for a while and then bowed her head and said, "IWW will let you touch my ears for a while in return," and started twitching her ears. Tatsuya, who saw the two white ears moving to and fro in front of him, unconsciously moved his hand and started rubbing them with a satisfied smile on his face, while Kaneko was making small moans because of the pleasure. Seeing the smile on Tatsuya's face, the other Nekasha took out their ears and tails as well and then sat around Tatsuya, letting him drown in fluffiness. The others who were left behind and were forced to watch them were looking at the other girls hatefully, except for Ophis, who didn't know what was happening. After a while, when Tatsuya was completely satisfied, he let the others go, who were taking deep breaths to calm themselves. Kaneko then looked at Tatsuya and said, why you will have to take our responsibility for this senpai." Tatsuya, who heard that, immediately hugged Kaneko and said, "Then from now on you are my kitty." Kaneko, who was being hugged by Tatsuya, was in a bliss and had a happy expression on her face. She then looked at Ophis and gave a victorious smirk to her. Ophis, who saw the smirk, didn't know why, but somehow she felt angry by that. She then pulled Tatsuya's sleeve, making him focus on her. Seeing that Tatsuya was now looking at her, she put both her hands in her head, imitating the cat ears, and while tilting her head said, "Nya." Tatsuya was then left motionless, and a stream of blood was coming out of his nose, which made all of them shocked, as this was the first time that they saw Tatsuya having a nosebleed. Ruya immediately put a serious expression on her face and said, "See it, all of you. I am hurt to say this, but looks like Ophis is the last boss among us." All of them who heard her statement nodded their head and decided to make sure to not let Ophis get ahead of them. Ophis then looked at Kaneko and with a small smile said, "I win." Chapter 145, Open House 1. The next day, Tatsuya, who was sleeping along with his girls, woke up when he heard his phone ringing. He got up and moved the girls away without waking them up, and then looked at his phone. Seeing the person who was calling him, he smiled and took the call. After he was done speaking on the phone, he woke up the others, who reluctantly had to wake up because of Tatsuya yelling at them. Tatsuya looked at the girls and said, "Don't forget that today is the open house. Get ready, or we will be late." He then looked at Kuroka and threw a bracelet towards her and said, "That will prevent your energy from leaking. You can visit your sister if you want to." Kuroka, who heard his explanation, looked at the bracelet with shining eyes and nodded her head and said, "Thank you Tatsuya." Tatsuya only nodded and then said, "Get ready and go to school. I have to pick up someone first, so go ahead of me." This statement made all of them snap out of their tardiness, and they started looking at Tatsuya intently and asked at the same time, "Who is it?" Tatsuya looked at them with neutral expression and said, "A subordinate of mine." Hearing his answer, all of them narrowed their eyes, and Kurumi asked, "Is it a girl?" Tatsuya only nodded and said, "Before your mind falls into the gutter, you all should know that she is already married and have a daughter close to our age." All of them then sighed in relief and smiled at him, trying to show that they didn't doubt him. Tatsuya only shook his head and then left the room to take a bath. After he was done taking a bath, he wore his uniform and then took out his car and left for the station. After he picked up the person who called him this morning, Tatsuya was on his way to school along with her. The lady looked at him and asked, "You sure have grown quite handsome in the time we didn't met." Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulder and said, "Look who was talking. The first time we met, your whole body was covered in wounds, and you looked like you have been starved for years." The lady just put her hand on her mouth and said, "Fufufu, well, what can I say? It is all because of you that I was able to live my life once again. I would have died there if not for you." Tatsuya smiled and said, "Well, don't mention it. I got quite a reliable person to manage my stores in Kyoto. That is enough for me. You don't have to feel grateful for that." The lady just smiled and said, "So how is your sex life going? Any progress, or are you still dash?" Tatsuya's lips twitched, and he said, "Don't you think that your question is quite inappropriate to ask someone so casually?" The lady just chuckled and said, Era, don't mind such things, you can freely talk to me about that. I am just like your mother." Tatsuya snorted and said, "There is no way a mother will ask her child about her sex life." Tatsuya then sighed and said, "So how is it going with that fallen masochist?" The lady had a slight blush on her cheeks and she said, "Well, it's better than before. We can meet more often compared to the time before when our family got separated. And I get to try new stuff on his from time to time now. Just thinking about it is making me hot." Tatsuya looked at her with a weird look on his face and said, "Like mother, like daughter. Both of you have the same qualities. No, she has inherited her father's qualities as well." At this, the lady got quiet and asked, "Do you think that she will hate me for not being near her for all this time?" Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Who knows, but I can guarantee that your family will be back together sooner or later. So you don't have to stress too much." The lady just smiled at him and then said, "So how does my daughter been, and does she look?" Tatsuya just took out his phone and showed the image to her. The lady looked at the photo for a while and then said, "She looks just like me." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, just her chest is even larger than yours." The lady just laughed and said, "Well, good for her, I guess." Tatsuya nodded and then stopped his car and said, "So we are here. I will show you the way to her class and then go back to mine." The lady shook her head and said, "You can go. I will find the class on my own. I also have to prepare myself mentally before meeting her." Tatsuya stared at her for a while and then said, "As you wish, but if you are unable to find her, just give me a call." The lady looked at him with a questioning gaze and then asked, "Won't you get disturbed by that? Isn't it the open house today?" Tatsuya looked at the school building and stared at it for a while and then said, "There will be no problem with that. It's not like I will be troubled by it. You should know that I have quite an authority in the school," he said, and then locked his car and then parted with the lady. Chapter 146, Open House 2. Both the lady and Tatsuya were walking towards the school gate, and Tatsuya noticed that no one from the student council was standing there. He then looked at his watch and saw that the school was going to start in a few minutes, which explained why no one was standing in front of the gate. Tatsuya on his way decided to make the lady beside him a bit familiar with the school before he goes his own way. Both of them then went inside the building and saw a lot of people standing there in the hall, and just when both of them entered, all the parents and students looked towards them, and the while hall fell silent. This made both Tatsuya and the lady confused, and both of them started looking at the surroundings, but once they noticed the gazes that were drawn on both of them, Tatsuya sighed while the lady just chuckled. The lady looked at Tatsuya and whispered, "Aren't you quite popular?" Tatsuya looked at the lady and said, "Says the one who is being stared at by all these males. If that masochist come to know about this, all these men would be slaughtered." The lady just chuckled and said, "What can I say? He is quite protective of me." Tatsuya sighed and then looked back at the men with a cold glare, making all of them immediately look away, while the girls only got more excited about him. Tatsuya ignored their gazes and then walked with the lady and was talking with her. While both of them were climbing on the stairs, suddenly a person came in his way, making both of them startled. Both of them stopped, and the person in front of them stopped as well. When the girl who was standing in front of Tatsuya looked at him, she smiled and said, Era, Tatsuya-kun, what a coincidence to meet you here. Who is the lad? Why?" She then turned her head and looked at the lady walking beside Tatsuya, and after looking at her for a while, the girl became speechless. Tatsuya, who felt that the things were getting quite awkward, said, "Shall we go to the terrace, Akino, Shuri-san?" Both the ladies silently nodded their heads while both of them had some tears in their eyes. Tatsuya sighed and then started walking along with the mother and daughter towards the terrace. Once all of them were at terrace, Akino immediately hugged her mother and cried loudly, and seeing that Shuri did the same as well. Tatsuya stood a bit away from the mother and daughter and formed a barrier around them so that their voice does not leak out, while also added a time dilation in it so as to let the time inside the barrier be slower, as they would get late if you didn't do that. Once both the mother and the daughter stopped crying, Tatsuya moved towards the two of them and offered both of them a handkerchief to clean their faces. After both were done with that, Akino looked at Shuri and said, "How are you still alive? I thought that you were killed back then." Shuri just gave a helpless smile and said, "Instead of being killed, I was taken in as a prisoner by the ones who came to attack me in order to get information on the fallen." She then turned her gaze at Tatsuya and said, "But seeing that I didn't have any information that was useful for them after all the torture they did to me, they decided to kill me, but I was somehow able to get away from them, but still was followed by them. If not for him being there, I would have died." Akino then looked at Tatsuya waiting for his explanation, and on seeing that, Tatsuya said, "I have some relationship with the Shinto in the Yukai faction and was acting as a guard for the head of the Yukai faction while we were making some deals with the Himajimas. But I got very bored standing out and work as guard, so I left my post and let the others who came with us do the guarding and started looking around the shrine. And to my luck, I met a lady who was wearing tattered clothes and her body was full of wounds." "What rest can you ask from your mother?" Akino nodded and then asked, But why didn't you contacted me if you were alive? Why you didn't try to look for me? At this, Shuri looked at Tatsuya with a glare and said, well, after I was rescued by Tatsuya-chan, he offered me to work under him and manage his restaurants in Kyoto, while he promised me to look for my daughter, and he did so as well. But the amount of work that I have to manage there is simply too much to let me take leaves. Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, you have to work to earn your pay, and by no means your pay is low, is it, Shuri-san? Shuri sighed and said, that is the only reason that I didn't leave my job. If not for it helping me to buy new toys to use at night, I would have already left. Tatsuya smiled and said, don't forget the protection that you are getting against those who still oppose you even after your banishment. Otherwise you would be back in the same situation. Shuri snorted and said, I truly want to deny that, but I know that it is true. Honestly, I don't know how were you able to control those bastards from the family. Tatsuya just smiled and said, making a male see his little brother being cut over and over again will make them fear a bit, and regarding the females, they all are obedient to the clan head. Seeing his smile, both the girls shivered a bit and said at the same time, sadist. Tatsuya looked at them with a dumbfounded expression on his face and said, you two are the last people that I want to call me sadist. Both of them just chuckled and Akino said, don't worry Tatsuya-kun, it only adds more to your charm. Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, yeah whatever, let's get going to the class or we will be late. Tatsuya then dispelled the barrier around them and left for his class, leaving the other two behind. Akino looked at her mother and with a smile on her face asked, so shall we get going? I will introduce you to my friends later. Shuri smiled mischievously and said, so you like Tatsuya-chan, huh? At this Akino blushed a bit and said, era, looks like Oka-san caught me. Shuri nodded and said, well don't worry, I have quite a good opinion of him. Just hurry up and let me play with my grandchildren soon. Akino just chuckled and said, well who knows, your wish might be granted soon. I am feeling hot just from thinking about the affair. Shuri nodded at her daughter and said, looks like you have been raised well. Don't worry, I will teach you all my ways of the bed. And after that both of them started chuckling. Meanwhile Tatsuya, who heard what they were talking about through his telepathy, shivered a bit and said, crazy mother and daughter. Like hell I am into the ways of that masochist fallen. He then sighed and a small smile appeared on his face and said, well at least they were able to meet each other again. And then entered his classroom. Chapter 147, Open House 3. When Tatsuya entered the class, all the eyes were on him. All the students and those who came from their home to see them along with the teacher present in the class were looking at him, and needy their gazes. Tatsuya did a small bow and said, sorry for being late, sensei. There was a lady who was not able to find her daughter's class, so I was helping her. The teacher nodded his head and with a smile on his face said, no problem Tatsuya-kun, just take your seat, we were just about to start the activity. Tatsuya nodded and then looked at the parents and bowed and said, sorry for this disturbance, and then went in his seat and sat down. The teacher looked at all the students in the class and then with a nod said, today in the class you all are going to make a sculpture with the paper mache that we have prepared for you all. You can make whatever you like and put all the imagination that you possess in your work. The students who were sitting in the first rows stood up and started to distribute the paper mache to the students in their respective rows. Tatsuya looked at his mache for a while thinking what to make, and soon an idea came to his mind and he immediately started to work on his sculpture. While Tatsuya was busy making a sculpture, the girls from his group who were present in his class looked at him and thought at the same time, I will make a sculpture of Tatsuya since I am sure that he is going to make a sculpture of mine as well. Though he will make one for the others as well, but that doesn't matter. You will make one of mine, and that's what's important. Tatsuya, who was unaware of the thoughts that the girls were having, was totally engrossed in making his sculpture and was not even bothered to look at others. One by one the others were showing their sculptures to the teachers and their parents and were getting praises, but suddenly the girls started making an uproar, making all the people present in the room focus on the crowd gathered around some students. Himari, Asia, and Kagura, who were done with their Tatsuya sculpture, became the center of attention as the sculpture was made very well. It really does look like Tatsuya-kun. Yeah, those cold eyes that can make you shiver at one glance. I can't take it anymore. And the said girl fainted with a stream of blood coming out of her nose. Che, even his sculpture looks better than me. How the hell am I going to get a girlfriend? You do, this is very unfair. Hey Amari-san, I am willing to pay for this sculpture. Will you sell it to me for 5,000 yen? No, if you're selling it then give it to me for 7,000. 10,000. 12,000. 15,000. And the price kept on rising. Suddenly Tatsuya stood up from his seat and said, done. Hearing him, all the girls looked at him, and some of them asked, hey Tatsuya-kun, what did you make? Yeah, show us. It must be something great. Tatsuya just smiled and said, well, I don't know if this will be good or not, but I was curious about this for quite some time, so please don't make fun of me. The three girls from the group had a smile on their faces and thought, these girls will be left with jealousy once they will see the sculptures of us made by Tatsuya. Tatsuya then smiled and took out the sculpture that he had made from behind him and showed it to others, leaving all of them, even his group, completely speechless. What Tatsuya showed them was a chunk version of himself with a smile on his face, but that was not the thing that made them speechless. The thing with his sculpture was that he made wolf-like ears and tail on his body, while the sculpture's head was tilted cutely, making it look absolutely adorable. Tatsuya, who was looking at his classmates waiting for their comments, but saw that none of them were saying something. Tatsuya was about to ask them when suddenly all the girls, along with the ones standing among the parents, fainted with satisfied smiles while having a nosebleed. Heck, even some males fainted as well. Dude, I don't know why, but my heartbeat increased for a while there. Yeah, I know the same happened to me. Both of them then looked at each other and slapped each other with all their might and said in unison, we are completely straight. All of the ones then started waking up, and all the girls looked hungrily at Tatsuya's direction, and one of them said, Tatsuya-kun, that kind of thing does not suit you. Give it to me, I will take care of it. Don't listen to her, Tatsuya-kun, give it to me. That kind of thing will be wasted on her. You girls are very young to handle such stuff. Boy, give it to this lady, here, said someone from among the parents. Give it to me and I will let you have some fun. Huh, look what you speak, you hag. Oi, mind your tongue, little girl. Shut up, hag. Why the hell will he give this deal? Heh, you want to have it the tough way? Please maintain the order of the class. We don't want to have violence now, do we? Shut up, sensei. Can't you see the matter is getting heated up? Go, go. You can win this. Beat her up. Tear up her clothes till there is nothing left. You recording all this, right? Don't worry, dude. I cannot miss a chance to see a violent strip show. Hee, we will have a lot of fun. The evening. Sensei, what are you doing here? Shut up and focus on recording. Tatsuya looked at the scene of chaos in front of him and had a sweat drop. Some ladies were having a battle royal without any care for decency while the men and the boys were busy recording this event. The remaining girls were looking at the said males with a disgusted expression. Tatsuya sighed and looked at his group along with Isami and Zenovia and said, let's get out of this class. All of them didn't say anything and just nodded and left the room along with him. Chapter 148. Open House 4. After all of them left the class, they soon meet up with rest of Tatsuya's group, and now they were all standing under a shade with Akino and Rias admiring each other's sculptures. I couldn't expect Oni Isama to make this. Yeah, I thought that he would make something like a sculpture of all of us, or something like that. Hey, the teacher literally said to make anything that comes to your mind, and this had been bothering me for quite a while. How would I have looked if I have animal features? Besides, I didn't have enough mache to make a sculpture of all of you. The girls only nodded and then looked back at the sculpture and said, well, whatever, this looks way better than any of our sculptures would have looked like. Yeah, it's kind of a first time to see him in such a state. Suddenly, they all noticed a huge crowd running towards the gymnasium while something about a magical girl photo shoot. They all looked at each other and said in unison, she is here. All of them then hurriedly started running towards the gymnasium, and once they entered, they saw a twin-tailed magical girl doing various poses standing on the stage while the boys kept on taking her pictures. Suddenly, Saji came on the stage and said, hey, all of you, stop this at once and go back to your classes. Hey, why are you here? Yeah, this is just a photo shoot. I am here on the behalf of the student council, and I have been asked to maintain the order here. Stop being a stick in the mud, man. Suddenly, the atmosphere around them turned cold, and all of them heard a voice which sent a shiver down their spines. Oi, can't you hear what he said properly, or are all of you deaf? Besides, who gave you the rights to take pictures of my girl? All of them then turned around and saw Tatsuya walking towards them with his hands in his pockets while looking coldly at them. All of them gulped and immediately fell on their knees and said, we are sorry about that. Tatsuya didn't release the pressure around them and said, listen here, you bastards. I am giving you a total of 15 seconds to delete each and every picture that you have taken, and after those 15 seconds, if I found any pictures of her then. Tatsuya didn't said anything after that, but that was enough to make them immediately start deleting the photos. After 15 seconds were up, Tatsuya used his telepathy to read each of their minds, and once he was done checking them, he nodded and said, now scram. And immediately all of them ran away. Tatsuya then looked at the magical girl and who was jumping towards him. Tatsuya caught her and smiled at her, to which she smiled as well. But soon Tatsuya grabbed both her cheeks and stretched them with a bit of his strength and said, nice to meet you, Sarah. I missed you a lot. Now do you mind telling me what was that your intention while doing poses which showed your panties to those pervs? Sarah Fall, who's had her tears coming out of her eyes, looked at Tatsuya, who had no intention of leaving her cheeks anytime soon. Suddenly Sona came in the gymnasium and said, Wani-sama, and Tatsuya. Tatsuya and Sarah Fall looked towards Sona, and for a moment Tatsuya loosened his grip on her cheeks, and taking advantage of that moment, Sarah Fall immediately rushed towards Sona's direction and is behind her back and said, Sotan. Tatsuya-chan is being mean to me. Sona shifted her spectacles and said, it must be your fault, because Tatsuya dotes on you a lot, even after how you usually act. Ugh, that hurts, Sotan. No, I didn't do anything. Huh, who was the one posing in front of those pervs? Hey, I was only doing my job as a magical girl. Sarah Fall tried to protest, but Tatsuya immediately glared at her and said, they were literally taking part pictures of your panties. There, and you were telling me that it is not your fault. Sarah Fall immediately tried to hide behind Sona, but Sona had already moved away from her spot and was standing with Rias and the others. Sarah Fall tried to run towards them, but Tatsuya grabbed her shoulder and said, looks like I have to teach you a lesson about decency. I have no problems with you wearing a magical girl dress all the time, but you have to show some decency while you are at public. Tatsuya then dragged her towards a corner and started lecturing her while Sarah Fall was sitting in a seizo while listening to Tatsuya. All the others were looking at the scene with amusement, and Sona said, if someone were to tell that a Mao is being lectured on decency by a human, they will surely not believe it. She then paused for a while and said, but can't he make her stop wearing her magical girl costume in public? Himari then said, that dress is her trademark. Tatsuya would not do something that will make her change her originality. Sona sighed and said, I don't know whether to be happy about Tatsuya's nature or sad about Wani-sama's behavior. Sanan showed a mischievous smile and said, but you love that part of you sister as well, right? Sona started to blush and was about to retort, but before she was able to, Sarah Fall interrupted her and said, of course she likes magical girl costume, that's why dash. Sarah Fall then waved her wand around Sona and a few glitters came out of it, and immediately Sona's dress changed to a magical girl's as well. Hihi, I brought one for Soten as well. Tatsuya, who saw Sona in a magical girl costume, nodded his head and looked at Sarah Fall and said, nice job, Sarah, and showed a thumbs up. Sarah Fall looked at him for a while and then turned away with a pout on her face. Tatsuya looked at her and gave a sigh. He then pulled her towards himself and gave a kiss to her. Sarah Fall immediately got back to her cheerful mood and kissed him back and then separated herself from his embrace. All the girls standing there looked at Seraphol with a jealous expression, but suddenly Sona said, "Hey, how am I supposed to go out while wearing this?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Don't worry about that, just say that it is one of my hobbies and I made you wear this." Sona looked at Tatsuya and said, "That will not solve my problems at all." Seraphol just smiled and said, "Just say that I love my one-ichan so much that I want to wear the same thing as her." Sona looked at Tatsuya and said, "Fine, this is your hobby and you made him wear this. Let's go." Seraphol's face immediately became desperate. "Hey, what is wrong with saying that you love your one-ichan?" Sona glared at Seraphol and said, "I would rather die than say something like that." Seraphol immediately jumped in Tatsuya's embrace and started crying, "Tatsuya-chan, Sotan is being mean to me." Tatsuya looked at Sona with a blaming gaze and said, "Look what you did, you made her cry." He then looked at Seraphol and patted her head and said, There, don't cry." Sona only shifted her glasses and said, "Humph, rather than wasting your time while crying, just change my clothes." Seraphol looked at Sona with an innocent expression on her face and said, "I can't." All the girls looked at her with a dumbfounded expression and said, "Huh." Sona soon came back to her senses and said, "What do you mean you can't?" Seraphol still looked at her innocently and said, "I mean, if you want to put on something else, you have to take off the clothes you were wearing, and since you didn't take them off, I already destroyed them and put the dress on you." All the girls who now headed her answer looked at Sona to see what would she do next. Sona then started panicking and slowly shifted her gaze towards Tatsuya and with a smile on her face said, "You should be knowing something to help me, right, my dear boyfriend?" Tatsuya smiled and said, "Of course I can help you, my beloved girlfriend." Sona then started to smile and was about to ask him to turn her clothes back to normal, but before she was able to, Tatsuya interrupted her and said, "Just do the same pose that Sarah does and say I am the magical girl Sotan," with a smile on his face. Sona immediately became shocked and the rest of them started looking at her with an amused expression on their faces. Tatsuya continued to smile and said, "Hurry up, I am waiting." Sona, who saw his expression, gritted her teeth and thought, he is not joking. Sona clenched her fists and was about to do the pose, but Tatsuya interrupted her and said, "Oh, and show a smile on your face as well." Sona, who heard his request, glared at him and thought, "This damn bastard." Sona then smiled, which kept on twitching because of irritation, and then started doing the poses that Seraphol does and said, I am the magical girl SS Sotan," with a very bright red blush on her face. Tatsuya just smiled and hugged her and said, "Sakuwa-ti." Sona, who was being hugged by him, started blushing more intensely and started pushing him away but was not able to move him even an inch. She finally gave up after a while and said, "Now can you turn my clothes back to normal? I did what you said." Tatsuya just smiled mischievously and said, "Who said that you have to do this just once?" Hearing that, Sona froze up while Seraphol had stars in her eyes. The rest of the girls only looked at Sona with pity. Chapter 149, Open House 5. After Sona was finally able to make Tatsuya satisfied, he changed her clothes back to normal while also storing her while performance on his phone. Sona, who was now seen crying because of embarrassment, was in Tatsuya's embrace and was being comforted by him. Tatsuya, who has now started to feel a bit guilty for making Sona act like that, smiled wryly and asked, "Sotan, I said I am sorry about that." But Sona kept on crying and asked, "If you were sorry, then why did you kept on doing that?" Tatsuya just patted her head and said, "You were just looking so cute that time that I couldn't help myself. It's all your fault for being so cute." Sona blushed at that and looked up and said, "Baka." Tatsuya just smiled and wiped away her tears and said, "You look quite funny with those puffy eyes of yours." Hearing that, Sona got embarrassed once again and looked away with a pout on her face, making him laugh. Hearing him laughing, Sona sighed and said, "Are you free right now? I have to introduce you to someone." Tatsuya looked at her with a confused expression and said, "Who?" At this, Sona averted her eyes and started playing with her fingers. "My parents want to meet you and want to see how my fiancé is." Hearing that, all of them got surprised, but before Tatsuya could respond, Seraphol interrupted and said, "You mean ma'am and dad are here?" Sona looked at her sister and nodded her head, making her sister tear up and said, "You are so mean, Sotan. You tell our parents about the open house, but not to me." Sona just adjusted her glasses and said, "Of course, I will tell them. After all, it is the parents who are mostly expected to come to the open house." Seraphol shook her head and said, No, Sotan, you should tell about your sister about all this. Just like when you were young, following me while calling one-ichan, you should be just like you used to." Sona just sighed at her sister's antics and said, "Leaving that, Tatsuya, will you come?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Well, yeah, I will have to do it sooner or later, so let's do it." Sona then looked at Seraphol and asked, "Have you told them about our relationship with Tatsuya?" Seraphol just nodded and said, "Yeah, I already showed them the video of the game between you two and my relationship with him." Sona sighed and said, "So that's how they come to know about him." "One-isama, didn't you promise that we will inform them together?" Seraphol just snorted and said, "If I were to leave that to Sotan, then we would have had a child before our marriage. That's how shy you were to tell them about him." Hearing that, Sona became red from embarrassment. Tatsuya looked at Sona and said, "So you feel ashamed to tell others about me? Huh. Looks like I'm not up to your expectations." Hearing that, Sona started to panic and looked at Tatsuya and said, "There is no way that you are not up to my expectations. It's just dash." Sona became silent and covered her face with her hands. Tatsuya removed her hands from her face and said, Sotan is very shy." Sona remained silent for a while and then said, "I hate you." Tatsuya hugged her and said, "Love you too." Tatsuya was then separated from the Sona by the rest of his girls, who pulled him back and looked at Sona and Seraphol, and Miyuki said, Now before we meet them, there are some things that we should make clear, right?" Hearing that, Sona and Seraphol became serious and nodded, and Sona said, "Of course, we know the term of the agreement." Seraphol then said, "We will not ask to become his first wife, as that position is already for Kurumi-chan." Hearing that the rest of the girls nodded but Miyuki snapped and said, "Oi, well you should say Miyuki-chan." But Tatsuya retorted and said, "Sorry Miyuki, but that place is for Kurumi, and you know it." Miyuki looked at Tatsuya with a pout and said, "Fine Oni-sama. But the second place is mine." Tatsuya nodded and then said, "Well let's get going then." All of them then nodded and started walking towards the main building. Rias, who was walking beside Akino, looked at her and said, "Akino, why are you being so silent all of a sudden?" Akino, who was lost in her thoughts, snaps out of it and said, "Era, I was just making plans on how to cause an affair." Hearing that, Rias only sighed and continued to walk with everyone. Soon all of them were in the main building and were walking around to find Sona's family. Suddenly all of them heard a voice and turned around. "Oh, Isami." All of them turned around to see a group of people standing there, and seeing them all of their lips twitched. In front of them was a group of 8 individuals. 2 men with red hair, 1 man with brown hair, 1 man with black hair, and 2 ladies with black hair, but different hairstyles, and 1 lady with brown hair. There was also a boy with him which looked around the student's age with brown hair, and seeing him, Tatsuya immediately recognized him. All of them then walked towards the group, and all of them bowed in front of them. Isami looked at the man who called her and said, "Hey dad." One of the red-haired man who had a small beard looked at Rias and said, "So this is where you were, huh, Rias?" Rias nodded and said, "Yes, father." Hearing that, some of the girls in the group got surprised and looked at the man in front of them. Isami, who was shocked by the information, looked towards the man with widened eyes and said, "Prez's father." The man looked at Isami and said, "So you are Isami Hiwado. I am Rias's father." He then looked at the others, and with a smile on his face said, "Thanks for taking care of my daughter." All of them nodded, and then Tatsuya looked towards the boy and said, "Long time no see, Issei." Hearing that, all the attention got on the 2 boys, and suddenly Issei realized something and said, "If I remember correctly, you are Shiba or something. We went to the same school before, right?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Yeah, I am honored that you remember me from that long ago." He then looked at Issei and Isami's parents and said, "Nice to meet you as well, Mr. and Mrs. Hiwado." Both the parents just smiled and said, "Nice to meet you again, Tatsuya-kun." Isami then went towards her mother and then whispered something to her, and seeing that her face immediately brightened up and said, "Era, so you were the boy Isami told us about, Isami's boyfriend who is quite popular among the ladies." Hearing that, all of them looked at the girls standing behind Tatsuya and just nodded their heads. Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Well, what can I say? I am quite loved." Issei looked at the girls standing behind him and thought, "Damn, he even have his harem. Looks like it is easy to get girls in a school like this. Why didn't I get accepted here?" Hearing his name, the 2 black-haired man and woman who were apparently Sona's parents came forward and started looking at him. Tatsuya looked at the 2 of them and with a bow said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Shirtorai." Hearing him calling the 2 of them by their fake names, both the parents got surprised but soon calmed down and smiled and said, "Nice meeting you, Tatsuya-kun. My daughter have told quite a bit about you," said the man. Tatsuya continued to smile and said, "I hope that all of them were good things." The man just smiled and said, "Yeah, in fact, I even stopped bothering to listen to what she was saying after a while. It looked like you had no flaws at all. Except dash." The aura around him started to get a bit dark and he said, "Looks like you're in quite a lot of relationships," while he continued to smile. Tatsuya just smiled as well and said, "Yeah, like I said, I am quite loved and I am truly grateful for that." The man was about to ask something more, but her wife hit her head and said, "Darling, don't you think that it is not a place where we should talk about such topics?" The man who was hit by her wife pointed her finger at Tatsuya and said, "But how can I expect someone who is having so many affairs to keep my daughters happy after he marries them?" Hearing him, all the parents and Issei got shocked and started looking around ready to apologize to the others for the disturbance, but stopped when they noticed that none of them were bothered by it and were confused. But soon the devils looked at Tatsuya, who nodded his head, confirming that he had already formed a soundproof barrier around them. Tatsuya then looked at Sona's father and said, "I don't think that this place is very appropriate for such chats, so why don't we go to my home and continue our talk there?" Sona's father just grumbled and said, "Very well, but don't expect that I will let you have my daughters so easily." Tatsuya just nodded and said, "Try all you want," making the black-haired man more pissed, while her wife and Shuri just chuckled. He then looked at others and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Hiwado, why not accompany us as well? I mean, we all have the similar situations, right?" Both the parents then looked at Isami and nodded their head when they saw her blushing. Tatsuya then looked at Surzex and his father and asked, "And what about you, Surzex? If both you and your father are not busy, so why not come to my home and we all can have a nice long chat with others over a drink?" Surzex just smiled and looked at his father, who nodded in response. Shuri, who was not asked by him, came to his side and tapped on his shoulder and said, "What about me, boss? Am I not invited?" and chuckled. Tatsuya noticed how she tried to tease him by calling him boss in front of others. He smiled and said, "Of course you and Akino are invited. After all, you have a vacation for a week to spend with her. So you will be staying in the house if you have not made plans to stay with Akino already." Shuri just smiled and said, "Well, I was planning on staying with her, but can't she stay with me in your house?" Hearing what Shuri said made Akino brightened up, and she showed a thumbs up to her mother and thought, "Good job, Oka-san." Tatsuya, who didn't find any problem with it, just nodded and then looked at the others and said, "Sorry for all that. Shall we get going then?" All the parents looked at each other and nodded and started following him. Meanwhile, Issei was already dragged by his 2 old friends on their spy spot. Chapter 150. 3 Magical Words. After all of them were at Tatsuya's home, all of them were surprised on seeing how big his house was. Isami's parents were quite shocked on seeing it, as they normally don't see a house this big. While the devils were slightly surprised by it, as they have already experienced living in castles, but since they knew the fact that Tatsuya was an orphan but still had such a house, made her surprised. Shuri looked at the house and said, Tatsuya-chan, can I buy such a house from the salary you give me? Tatsuya just smiled and said, maybe, who knows, but I can guarantee that a house half the size of this will be no problem for you with half a year's salary of yours. Hearing that, Shuri started thinking about something and said, looks like my job is not that bad. Half the size with half a year's salary is quite a good offer. Tatsuya nodded and said, yeah, it is, so make sure to do the work that is being piling up while you are on the vacation diligently. He said that and Shuri's brow immediately twitched, and she said, you know I cannot enjoy my holidays if you keep reminding me about that. Tatsuya just chuckled and said, well, as your boss, I have to keep reminding you not to slack off. Hearing that, Shuri looked away and thought, he is having revenge for earlier. Tatsuya then invited all of them inside and then made them sit in the drawing room where they started to watch the video clips that they have recorded. Tatsuya placed some bottles of alcohol in front of them, making the men extremely happy with the quality of the drink, while the women just sighed on seeing the antics of the men after they were under the effect of alcohol. Tatsuya's clone and the girls then went inside to prepare food for all of them, while Tatsuya was sitting in front of his would-be in-laws. Tatsuya looked at them for a while and then both the men asked at the same time, do you truly love our daughters, or are you just playing around? Tatsuya looked at both of them sincerely and said, I truly love your daughters a lot, and I promise you not let any of them feel unhappy at any point of their life. At this, the Citri head snorted and said, and what if we were to ask you to leave the rest of your lovers aside, or choose one over the other? Just as he said that, a lot of noise of plates being shattered came from the kitchen. Tatsuya smiled wryly and said, don't worry girls, everything is fine here. Tatsuya looked at the Citri head and said, a word of advice from me, father-in-law. Do keep your voice down a bit for your own safety. He was about to say something, but suddenly he felt the aura of the girls they were releasing unconsciously coming from the kitchen and gulped his saliva. Bad nodded his head. Tatsuya just smiled and said, about what you said before, no, I'm not going to break up with any of them till they themselves tell me that they are fed up with me. Do you have any problem with that? The Citri head nodded and said, even if I don't have a problem, how can I expect that you will not just forget about my daughters if some new women came around? Tatsuya sighed and said, you can ask them this yourself, but I have never neglected any of them. Any of them have never complained about that, and I try to spend time with all of them. They are as precious to me as they are to you. Mr. Hewadu then asked, and are you able to save them from any danger? Because concerning your looks and their beauty, they are bound to get in some sort of trouble by either yours or their admirers. Tatsuya just smiled at this question and said, oh, don't worry about that, Mr. Hewadu. Firstly, I think they are strong enough to handle around those pests, but if by chance there were to appear a cockroach who was very unwilling to die, then let's just say that you would not like to hear the details, he said and showed a kind smile, making all four of them shiver up a bit. Mr. Hewadu then asked, then what about taking care of all of them in future? Can you take care of all their needs and the need of the children you will have in future? Tatsuya smiled and said, that must be the last thing that you should worry about, Mr. Hewadu. My business is quite good, and you can rest assured that your daughter will not have any trouble in the future. If you have any doubts, we can go together to my office, and I can let you have a look on how my business is coming along. Hearing that, Mr. Hewadu looked at him for a while, and then his wife elbowed him from the side and said, don't you think that this is quite enough for you to ask? I don't think that he is a bad child, and Isami loves him. What's more do you want? Just accept it already. Mr. Hewadu sighed, and then a smile appeared on his face, and he said, well, I guess my Isami will be in your care, son. Tatsuya just smiled and said, thanks a lot, and I promise that I won't let you down, father. Mr. Hewadu nodded his head, and then looked the Citri couple and said, well, what about your decision, Mr. and Mrs. Shirtorai? Mrs. Shirtorai just smiled and said, do both of you mind if we ask something to him in private? The Hewadu couple looked at each other, and then at the Shitoris, and then with a smile nodded and left the room, and went back to the drawing room where Surzex and Zeoticus were sitting. Just as they left the room, Tatsuya immediately formed a barrier around the room, and Mr. Citri started releasing his aura in order to pressure Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who felt the huge aura that the Citri head was releasing, smiled and then released a bit of his aura, which immediately overpowered Citri's, and he started panting. Tatsuya looked at him and said, satisfied with my power? The devil looked up with difficulty but was not able to say anything. Seeing that, his wife got surprised and immediately said, now Tatsuya-kun, there is no reason to go that far, right? Tatsuya just nodded and stopped releasing his aura. He then looked at the panting Citri and offered him a bottle of water, which he gulped down in one go. He looked at Tatsuya with an amazed expression and said, you are packing quite a strength there. Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, don't flatter me now. He then turned serious and said, I once again ask you to give me a chance to marry your daughters. I promise you that I will never let any harm come in their way and will take good care of them in future, and bowed his head. Seeing him bow his head, the Citri head sighed and said, raise your head. He then looked at Tatsuya with a smile on his face and said, I will let you marry my daughters, but make them sad even once and you will have to deal with the whole Citri territory. Tatsuya just smiled and thought, if only you were to know the exact level of my power, then you well have not even thought of saying something like that. He then nodded and said, don't worry, they will never be sad. In fact, I promise to make them even more happier than their father ever made them. Hearing that, Lady Citri just chuckled while her husband just glared at Tatsuya and said, you have quite the mouth, son. Tatsuya continued to smile and said, thanks a lot, father. While both of them kept glaring at each other. After all the matters were settled and all of them were having a nice meal together, suddenly Zeoticus looked at Tatsuya and said, hey Tatsuya-kun, mind if we have a little chat somewhere more privately? Tatsuya looked at Surzex, who looked back at him with a confused expression on his face. Tatsuya looked at Zeoticus and said, sure, why not, Mr. Gremory? He then looked at the others and said, please excuse us for a while. And both of them then left the room and went to the drawing room and sat down facing to each other. Both of them had a smile on their faces when suddenly Zeoticus put a barrier around them, on noticing which Tatsuya narrowed his eyes and asked, "So what is it that you want to ask, to not only let a sound barrier but also an entrance barrier places around us?" Zeoticus just laughed and then said, "You see Tatsuya-kun, a few days ago we received a notice from the Shinto faction about the rights that the Grimoire had over this town being taken from them because of bad management." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, the territory was very poorly managed by her, so I had to take this decision." Zeoticus just smiled and said, "I apologize on her behalf, but don't you think that everyone should get a second chance to overcome their mistakes?" Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Yes, I do believe in that ideology." Hearing that, Zeoticus's smile widened and he was about to say something, but Tatsuya interrupted him and said, "That's why I am giving myself a second chance to govern this territory," and showed a smile. Seeing his smile, Zeoticus's lips twitched and he said, "You have quite the sense of humor, don't you? Well, let's get straight to the point here. What do you want in exchange to giving the rights of town to the Grimoires?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "Sorry, I am not doing trade here." Zeoticus's smile disappeared from his face and he said, "Listen here, you are just a human. You should be happy that a devil, much less a devil belonging to a high-class family, is making deals with you." Tatsuya, who saw the look on his face, also became expressionless and looked at him. Seeing the human's expression change, Zeoticus widened his eyes and asked, "What? You want to say something?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, Seeing you, I cannot help but say those three magical words." He then paused for a while and then lifted his fist. "Fuck OFF asshole," and showed the middle finger to the devil.
That is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please drop a comment down below.